Hey guys, imagine witnessing the mighty King of England, the golden boy of the Renaissance, slowly rotting away in full royal regalia, every gasp, every groan, every drip of pus. Terrifying, right? Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. The horrible death of Henry VIII, Part 1. At dawn on June 28, 1491, in the royal apartments at Greenwich Palace, a chubby infant let out a hearty cry that echoed off the carved oak walls. He was christened Henry, the second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and few could have suspected that this plump newborn would one day reshape the destiny of England, and then, in his final years, become a horrific example of man's capacity for self-destruction. From the moment he could walk, young Henry was the embodiment of vigor. Portraits later commissioned by his court show a rosy-cheeked toddler, a ready smile on his lips, a glint of mischief in his eyes. At 4, he chased after squirrels in the palace gardens. By 7, he'd mastered the joust against much older boys, though the course was specially padded for him. Tutors at infancy declared him quick-witted. He devoured French, Latin, music, and religious texts with equal appetite. The Tudor prince was everything a king could hope for: athletic, handsome, charismatic, and utterly certain of his divine right. By his teenage years, he towered over most men in court, with broad shoulders and bounding energy. His laugh was described as rich as the autumn grape, and courtiers vied for his attention, performing dances, composing poems, or simply attending his banquets in hope of a nod or a grin. The young Henry was a living festival, yet beneath the bright facade there were shadows. His father's victory at Bosworth Field in 1485 had ended the Wars of the Roses, but the Tudor claim remained tenuous. Henry VII ruled with iron caution. Alliances had to be cemented, potential heirs eliminated, and rivals watched. Young Henry learned early that power required ruthlessness. When he was 10, his mother gave birth to a baby who died within hours. No public funeral, no ceremony. His uncle Prince Edmund, only 5, succumbed to measles the next year. Endemic disease and court plots were constant companions. At 15, Henry's cheeky humor sharpened into ambition. He turned from the arts to politics, guidance from his chaplain Thomas Cranmer, whispers from his father's counsel, and his own burgeoning belief in divine mandate. Henry VII, mindful of securing his dynasty, demanded obedience, but the prince bristled at any restraint. He wrote poetry extolling the glory of kings, imagining grand pageants in Florence and Madrid. He demanded ever more lavish tournaments, ever richer feasts. Money flowed from the royal coffers like melted butter. In the winter of 1509, Henry VII breathed his last. On April 21st, the 27-year-old prince ascended the throne with a roar, declaring himself King Henry VIII. The coronation, 3 weeks later, was the most sumptuous pageant England had ever seen. Gilded floats, pyrotechnics, jesters, and a cavalcade of foreign princes. The new king, resplendent in scarlet velvet trimmed with ermine, strode through London Bridge amid thunderous cheers. For a moment, it seemed Henry VIII would usher in an era of peace and prosperity. He married Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, in a grand ceremony more befitting a fairy tale than a political alliance. Diplomatic ties with Spain strengthened. France and Scotland watched warily. Henry adored Catherine's piety and gentle demeanor. He gifted her a string of pearls so brilliant they were called the Tears of Saint Peter. Court life reached dazzling heights. Banquets groaned under piles of swan, peacock, venison, and eels baked in pastry. Minstrels played lute and harp. Masks unfolded in candlelit chambers, where Henry, ever the showman, took lead roles. He challenged ambassadors to duels and treated his courtiers as friends rather than mere subjects. In his first years, he was the embodiment of the Renaissance prince, a warrior king on horseback, a patron of the arts, a scholar in velvet hose. But the seeds of downfall lurked beneath the opulence. From the first, Henry's passion for war and prestige outweighed the hard economics of governance. Expeditions to France, launched in 1512 and 1513, initially saw triumph. Calais retaken, the French king humbled on the battlefield of the Spurs, yet the costs soared. Taxes were raised to feed the mercenary armies. Londoners grumbled beneath the weight of heavy porterage and forced loans. Meanwhile, the jousting lists became Henry's obsession. It was said that he jousted more times in his first decade as king than any monarch since Charlemagne. Every fortnight he dressed in gleaming harness and rode out at dawn, his heavy pennon snapping in the breeze. He laughed as his courtiers flinched at his lance's impact. One scholar observed, perhaps wryly, "He jousts as if England were his private playground, though at what price, none dare ask." That price revealed itself one midsummer's day in 1536. Henry, now in his mid-40s, stepped into the tilt yard outside Greenwich's royal palace. Sunlight glinted off banners. Musicians played while the scent of roasting meats drifted on the breeze. Crowds gathered to watch their king. Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, sat in the royal gallery, her dark curls bouncing, her fans fluttering. Henry lifted his visor, grinned, then lowered it. The tilt barrier, a sturdy wooden fence, divided the lists. On the second pass, a miscalculation. Henry, charging at the tilt with full intent, jarred his right leg as his foot slipped in the stirrup. The impact flung him backward. He collided with the barrier's post, his thigh snapping against wood. Gasps rose from the gallery. Catherine covered her mouth. Courtiers rushed forward. Henry lay sprawled, visor askew, his crimson cloak stained with blood. At first he laughed. Pain be damned, he wanted nobody to pity him. But the swearing herald saw bone under ragged flesh. The king's physician, set upon him in moments, probed the wound with a red-hot iron to cauterize damage. Henry roared like an animal. That evening he was carried to his bedchamber, his thigh bandaged but throbbing with agony. The jousting accident marked the beginning of Henry's descent. In the days that followed, the wound refused to heal. Blackened flesh peeled back, revealing pustules that oozed foul-smelling liquid. The best surgeons in Europe were summoned, Venetian experts, French barbers, German empirics. They cut away dead tissue. They bathed the sores in wine and turpentine. They applied poultices of marigold and manure. Nothing stopped the rot. By autumn, Henry's vigorous rides were replaced by painful journeys in a wheeled sedan chair. The court whispered as the chair rolled through corridors. Our king, once invincible, is now laid low by a simple spill. Henry, desperate to regain his image, sat for new portraits, his codpiece padded, his doublet stuffed. The canvases showed a potent monarch, with shoulders squared, but the paint could not mask the distended belly or the dark circles beneath his eyes. As the wound festered, Henry's personality shifted. Gone was the easy laughter. In its place raged a suspicious, irritable sovereign. Cabinet meetings became litigious. Favored ministers were dismissed on a whim. Anyone who dared suggest dietary change, less meat, more vegetables, was banished. Catherine, watching her husband's suffering, sought to comfort him with gentle counsel, but Henry bristled at her concern. When she offered him a bowl of broth, he shoved it aside, saying, "I am a king, not a friar to sip such thin gruel." In the vaults of Hampton Court, joy drained away. The lavish banquets continued, but Henry's seat was half empty. When he did appear, he declined to rise for prayers or greetings. Instead, he sat slumped in his chair, face ashen, hands trembling. Servants whispered that the stench of his ulcerated leg stung the nostrils. Courtiers crossed themselves before attending him, praying not to touch the foul bandages. The king's appetite, however, remained voracious. If anything, it grew. Horse and cattle were butchered by the dozen. Barrels of wine were rolled into his chambers nightly. Painkillers existed only in theory. Laudanum, opiates, willow bark, none could dull the constant throb. He devoured longer meals to distract himself, though every swallow sent his heart racing. Political storms brewed outside his sick room. The Pilgrimage of Grace, rebellions in Ireland, shifting alliances with France and the Holy Roman Empire. Henry, indebted to bankers and nobles, demanded money, troops, loyalty. Documents piled on his desk. He signed decrees in agony, the quill slipping from his finger. Yet no minister dared question him. The king's temper, once a tool of awe, now ruled by terror. Through the winter of 1536 to 37, the wound deepened. Ancient stoicism kept Henry from admitting defeat. He forbade the doctors from amputating the leg. He'd heard tales of nobles who bled to death on the surgeon's table. A king does not lose limbs, he declared. Instead, he doubled down on treatments, leeches, electricity, prayer. Monks chanted psalms above him as he writhed in fever. His sixth marriage, to Catherine Parr, a scholar and gentlewoman, offered fleeting respite. She read to him from devotional texts, propped his pillows, oversaw the cleanliness of his chambers. Under her watch, he sometimes smiled, but the ulcers ravened on, and the gout, another consequence of his rich diet, flared in his swollen joints, leaving him bedridden for days. By the spring of 1537, Henry had spent more hours in bed than on his throne. The courtiers who once danced at his feet now feared the hush of approaching death. The royal chaplains whispered that the king's trial was at hand, that God himself would judge this man who had torn apart the Church of England to satisfy his passions. And so, in that cold, echoing palace, with dripping bandages piled like trophies of his folly, Henry VIII, once the grandest puppet master of Europe, found himself a helpless victim of his own overindulgence and pride. The stage was set for the final act, the horrifying collapse into death that would crown his life of power, wives, wars, and axes. By the spring of 1537, the winter winds still howled around Hampton Court's angular turrets, but inside the palace walls a different storm raged, one of smelling bandages, whispered prayers, and the low, constant whine of servants scurrying down corridors. Henry VIII, once the very image of imperial health, now spent his days swaddled in pillows, every breath a battle against the stench and pain that had become his closest companions. Early one April dawn, the Lord Chancellor slipped into Henry's chamber, bearing a sheaf of petitions from shattered estates in Yorkshire and a request for yet another loan from the city of London. The king's pen hovered over the inkstand, but his right hand shook so violently that quill met parchment in blotches. "My lord," he rasped, voice as dry as autumn leaves, "bring me the bolster. I cannot sign like this." Courtiers exchanged strained smiles. To refuse a chancellor's business was unthinkable, but to demand the bolster in the midst of state papers, madness. Yet madness, it seemed, had taken hold. The gout pulses in his knees like hot irons. The ulcers burned with every shift of weight. A single move might tear flesh anew. For relief, he demanded new entertainments, musicians to mask his moans, jesters to distract him for hours on end. One chronicler wrote that on May 1st, 1537, 2 lutes, 3 shawms, and a pair of trumpet players serenaded the king for his entire afternoon nap. When he awoke, he demanded more notes, higher, louder, as though musical volume could drown out the crack of bone and the drip of pus. Meanwhile, the court itself took on a macabre carnival atmosphere. Masks and hoods became common accessories, noblemen claiming illness, whispering of the royal plague. Any touch too near Henry's bedchamber meant a rubber glove of waxed leather and a quick jaunt to the royal laundry. Pages carried censers of frankincense. Priapic carvings were removed from tapestries lest they offend the king's fragile state. No one dared linger, for the slightest cough might be mistaken for mortality. Amid this horror show, political life churned on. Thomas Cromwell, once Henry's master architect of divorce and reformation, began to sense his own mortality. The fall of Anne Boleyn in 1536 had taught him that no favor was permanent, but Cromwell's schemes to marry the king to Anne of Cleves, to secure an alliance with German princes, went disastrously awry in January 1540. Henry, upon first sight of the portrait by Hans Holbein, snarled, "This is not Anne, it's some broad toad." Months of awkward courtship and Thomas's dutiful pleas melted before the king's wrath. By July, Cromwell lay executed on Tower Hill, head severed by a faulty executioner's axe. Watching the spectacle from his sedan chair, wooden wheels scuffed red with courtyard gravel, Henry felt both puppet and puppeteer. His body betrayed him, but his authority remained untouchable. Wives were discarded with the flourish of parchment. Jane Seymour, gone in 1537, died giving birth. Anne of Cleves divorced in 1540, Catherine Howard executed in 1542, and Catherine Parr almost undone by her own wit in 1543. Every marriage served politics, but behind each ceremony lay the brewing stench of decay in Henry's thighs. By the summer of 1540, the ulcer on his right leg had carved a cavernous hole the size of a human palm. At night, Henry insisted on his bedchamber windows thrown open, though the cool breeze sent shivers through courtiers in their velvet doublets. He claimed the fresh air helped stave off infection. His doctors whispered that the cold might slow the rot. Dozens of times they probed the wound with iron rods and blunted knives, just enough to clear dead tissue, but never enough to quell the spread. They wrapped fresh linen soaked in rosewater and wine, hoping the antiseptic might help. Instead, the king joked darkly, "My leg smells sweeter than the rose gardens of Chelsea." Pain was one thing. The real terror lay in uncertainty. Would the wound mend? Might he recover enough to don armor once more? Every morning, servants lowered a mirror behind his head so that he could inspect the bandages. Some days, the sight sent him into black moods, lashing out at nearby attendants. He would scream, "Fetch the surgeon! Drown me in laudanum if you must, but do whatever it takes." And in those moments, the king seemed less a divine sovereign and more a trapped beast, desperate for any release. Outside the private torture chamber of his apartments, Europe watched warily. Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire pressed his claims in the Netherlands. Francis I of France eyed Calais. Henry, though crippled, could still raise armies, if he could pay for them. Tax collectors fanned across England, stirring resentment in market towns and fishing villages. Peasants muttered of the old man's wars, while merchants groaned under levies for chainmail and cannon. In June 1541, a deputation from York petitioned the king to end the wars. They were sequestered in the Tower for their boldness. Meanwhile, the Reformation marched forward. The monasteries had been dissolved, their lands sold to nobles who had learned to crouch before Henry's throne. Every abbey's wealth filled the royal coffers, but the spiritual emptiness that replaced them could not be taxed. Parish priests preached in hushed tones, fearing the heresy laws. Even Thomas Cranmer, the archbishop who declared Henry's first marriage null and legalized the whole bloody business, trembled at the notion of a king in pain, lashing out unpredictably. By mid-1542, Henry's weight had ballooned further, his thigh so swollen that his bed had rails sewn into the mattresses to stop him rolling off. He could not stand, not for more than a few seconds. One wobbly upright moment could send him crashing back and reopen wounds. His surgeons, driven to exasperation, proposed radical measures, amputation of his right leg above the knee. Henry refused outright. "Am I then to run from the roar of my own footfalls?" he shouted. "No man shall call me cripple." So the rot continued, inching deeper. In August's heat, the smell became almost audible. Courtiers later swore they could smell the king's leg from across the palace green. One ambassador complained of passing out in the gallery. The king, amused, ordered his men to carry censers of clove and myrrh whenever they entered the throne room. "To gild a foul thing," he quipped. In the autumn of 1542, a new crisis erupted. Catherine Parr, now queen, fell dangerously ill with a fever, probably malaria contracted during the travel to the north to quell uprisings. Henry, delirious himself much of the time, refused to go to her bedside. "I cannot leave my ulcer," he insisted. The court held its breath. Would the queen die as so many others had? The king's jealousy flared. He did not relish the thought of Catherine consorting with physicians and nurses. When she recovered, she emerged with a new respect for Henry's suffering, one she could bear only from a distance. Winter pressed in cold and gray, snow dusted the palace roofs, and Henry's servants whispered of the snow that hides the blood. Candlelight flickered in the halls as the king lay gasping in damp sheets. His cough grew persistent. The hiss of fluid in his lungs added to the nightly soundtrack of suffering. Some nights he spat blood on the chamber floor. Others he wept quietly, mourning not life but the death of the man he once was. On December 25th, 1542, Christmas Day, the court gathered for Mass in St. George's Chapel at Windsor. Henry, carried in on a velvet-stuffed litter, wore his richest scarlet robes trimmed with ermine. As the bells pealed, he sat unmoving, eyes half-lidded. When the hymn began, he tried to stand, but his attendants caught him mid-rise. The king's face contorted. He gripped the arms of his litter as though fighting for purchase. Some said he recognized the irony of the season, the birth of a savior in a humble stable, while he, the most puissant king, lay broken by his own excess. It was the last time Henry ventured from his chambers. News of his weakness leaked quickly. Foreign dignitaries prepared for new regencies. English lords jockeyed for position at the inevitable moment of transition. Henry, hearing this talk, briefly revived. He summoned his council, insisting that no regency be declared until his death was certain. "Lest any knave claim my realm before my last breath," he warned. Then, as if emptied, he collapsed back onto pillows, eyes staring at the gilded ceiling. The weeks that followed passed in agonizing slow motion. Each tick of the clock brought fresh bandages, fresh poultices, fresh curses. His cough grew harsh, interrupting the whispered prayers in the antechamber. One night, a particularly deep, rasping fit echoed through the halls, followed by chilling silence. Courtiers exchanged glances. Had the king breathed his last on that single exhale? He hadn't, yet. But on January 28, 1543, with the dawn barely stirring the sky, Henry VIII's body finally surrendered. Surrounded by cryptic notes, shattered vials of alchemical concoctions, and his battered iron bedpan, the man who had reshaped England with sword and scroll slipped into a stillness that no surgeon could rouse. When the herald announced his passing, trumpets rang out across the realm. London Bridge lit beacons, bells tolled across every diocese. But the feast was bittersweet. A nation that had celebrated his triumphs now faced the legacy of his rot. The tomb prepared for him at St. George's Chapel stood empty, awaiting a king who would never sit again in the saddle. His body, embalmed with spices and wine, wound through the streets on a grand funeral hearse. A final parade of power, even in death. Thousands lined the route. Some wept, many prayed for mercy, others simply breathed easier, free at last from the stench of decay. And so ended Henry VIII's descent from the Golden Prince to the grotesque monarch, his life bookended by laughter and glory, his death defined by the very flesh that once symbolized his rule. Behind the velvet codpiece and jeweled crown lay a cautionary tale, that unchecked ambition, boundless appetite, and the refusal to reckon with failing flesh can turn a king into a horror story, and a kingdom into a kingdom haunted by its own sins. We return to the royal disaster zone, otherwise known as the body and final years of Henry VIII, a king whose life was a slow-motion catastrophe made of swords, bad diets, and even worse medical decisions. If you thought his leg ulcers were bad, wait until you hear what happened when his coffin started leaking in public. But first, when we left off, Henry VIII had just died after years of groaning, oozing, and yelling at everyone within a 10-foot radius. But death, as it turned out, was only the beginning of his final horror story. Let's rewind just a bit. In the final weeks of Henry's life, his palace didn't resemble a royal residence so much as a makeshift hospital with gold curtains. The rooms reeked of boiled linen, stale wine, and unrelenting fear. Every morning started the same. A physician would gently poke the king's shoulder to see if he was still breathing, and every time, Henry's snores answered with a wet, phlegmy yes. But even the doctors knew time was running out. His body was shutting down. His urine was described as thick and blackened, his breath sour and shallow. Toward the end, he developed a fever that left him delirious, raving about old battles, old enemies, and occasionally mistaking servants for long-dead wives. One report claims he once screamed, "Anne, release me," which was confusing since at least 2 Annes were definitely not taking his calls. And then, finally, January 28, 1547, the king slipped away, somewhere between night and dawn, surrounded not by family but by terrified servants and exhausted physicians. His final words? Lost. Perhaps they were a curse, perhaps just a grunt. But the legend goes that his last act was to stare at the ceiling, as if daring God himself to make good on all that divine right propaganda. But here's where it gets truly grotesque. When a monarch dies, there's a specific ritual: embalm the body, announce the death, plan the funeral. With Henry, this process was complicated by the fact that his body had already begun to decompose before he died. His ulcerated legs were so infected that the rot had spread internally. So when his heart stopped, the rest of his body basically said, "Finally, we can fall apart now." The embalmers arrived in full panic mode. Imagine trying to preserve a leaking meat sack with royal titles. They stuffed his body with spices, herbs, and cloth. They poured in wine and resin to try to stop the bloating. None of it worked. Within hours, his corpse had swollen and started to split in places. Yes, split. Eyewitnesses later said his abdomen cracked open like overripe fruit. And still, protocol demanded a public display. The funeral procession began days later, with Henry's massive, oozing body encased in an ornate coffin that was less resting place and more containment strategy. The coffin was sealed with wax and reinforced with iron bands. Even so, as the coffin made its way from Whitehall to Windsor, strange smells began to follow it. Thick, cloying, and unmistakably human. Now here's where legend and horror collide. On the second night of the journey, the procession stopped at Sion Abbey, a former monastery turned into a royal resting station. The coffin was placed in a chapel for overnight vigil. During the night, a grisly scene unfolded. The coffin, under pressure from the bloated corpse inside, burst. Fluids leaked onto the stone floor, pooling beneath the coffin. According to chroniclers, dogs entered the chapel and began licking the remains. That's right. The King of England, defender of the faith, was licked by stray dogs while decomposing in a church. Even worse, some priests took it as divine punishment, a literal manifestation of a prophecy made years earlier, that Henry would lie in state and be devoured by dogs. Now, was this all exaggerated? Maybe, but enough contemporaries recorded it that the story endured. And in Tudor England, where appearances were everything, this was the ultimate humiliation. A king who had demanded godlike reverence in life was now leaking onto floor tiles and becoming canine tapas. After that horror, the coffin was hastily cleaned and patched, and the procession continued to Windsor, where Henry was buried in St. George's Chapel, next to Jane Seymour, the only wife who died before he could get tired of her. And even that wasn't finished properly. Henry had designed a massive golden tomb for himself, complete with bronze angels, intricate carvings, and a statue of himself on horseback. But thanks to war, bankruptcy, and general disinterest, it was never completed. Henry VIII, once the most powerful man in England, was buried in an unmarked vault under the floor, with no monument, no statue, just a worn stone slab that says his name. If you visit today, you might walk over it without realizing. Now, let's step back. What does it mean when a king's death is this awful? Well, for one, it's the final perfect metaphor for his reign. Henry's life was about power, controlling wives, nobles, church, and even the afterlife. But his death proved that no amount of divine right or gold-embroidered pillows could stop what happens to every body. Decay, rot, and the slow, humiliating return to the earth. And yet, even in death, Henry VIII remained a force. His will, drafted not long before he died, was a masterpiece of paranoia and control. He named a council of 16 executors to rule for his young son, Edward VI, hoping they'd follow his plans. Spoiler, they didn't. Within months, the council fractured into rival factions, each trying to grab power, land, and influence. Henry's carefully constructed order collapsed like his abdomen. Meanwhile, across the country, people responded to his death with a mixture of relief and fear. Some mourned the passing of a mighty king. Others feared what came next, because while Henry was cruel, at least he was predictable in his cruelty. With a child king on the throne, chaos loomed, rebellions flared, Catholic uprisings threatened, and everyone braced for the storm of succession politics. And here's the kicker. Despite the horror of his death, Henry's legend grew. The Tudors were masters of PR. His reign was spun as glorious. His 6 wives became myth, and his rot, quietly scrubbed from official memory. Portraits still show him standing tall, chest out, beard shining with oil. The real Henry, this swollen, ulcerated, half-rotted man, is buried beneath centuries of propaganda. But we should remember, because Henry VIII's death wasn't just a grotesque ending. It was the natural conclusion of a life driven by excess, ego, and the constant fear of mortality. He wanted to be remembered as a god. He ended up as a cautionary tale. And so we close this chapter with a question. What does it say about a man and a monarchy when even in death his body refused to cooperate with dignity? For Henry VIII, his greatest enemy was never France, Rome, or even his own wives. It was himself, his appetites, his pride, and his refusal to admit that even kings rot. In the hush that followed January 28, 1547, England stood at a crossroads. The once mighty Tudor monarch lay silent beneath St. George's Chapel, his body consigned to a vault that bore little trace of his former grandeur. But even in death, Henry VIII's presence loomed large over the realm. His rot-ridden corpse may have finally ceased its agony, yet the forces he unleashed in life, religious upheaval, dynastic struggle, and the machinery of centralized power, rumbled on. Within days of his passing, the Council of Executors named in his will convened at Whitehall. 16 noblemen and clerics charged with guiding 9-year-old Edward VI until his majority found themselves balancing tribute to Henry's legacy against their own ambition. They read aloud passages from the king's final directives, stiff penalties for hoarding grain, strict oversight of the Church of England, and a stern injunction that no foreign prince should meddle in English affairs. Yet as each councillor bowed to swear fealty, they also weighed how to preserve or expand their own estates under the new regime. Outside London's gates, news traveled slower but no less dramatically. Parish priests delivered sermons that alternated between mourning and relief. In Norwich, Father Kent preached that Henry's dissolution of the monasteries had drained spiritual life, and that now England must atone. In Cornwall, a grey-bearded squire toasted the late king's martial prowess, even as he lamented the crippling taxes imposed to pay for endless French campaigns. Across villages and market towns, people whispered, "God rest him," with an awkward blend of reverence and exhalation, for while the king had been both tyrant and provider, his death meant the war levy would soon ease, and the pitch of candle taxes relent. Meanwhile, Edward VI's coronation was arranged for February 20th, less than a month after his father's funeral rites concluded. At just 9 years old, Edward had been seated on the throne with all the ritual pomp of his father's accession, robes of purple, a crown too heavy for his small head, and an anxious hush as the new king muttered his responses. Many courtiers noted Edward's pale complexion and quivering voice. Some feared the boy might shake under the weight of destiny, yet the ceremony pressed on, affirming that the Tudor line would endure, however tenuously. The regency government that took shape around Edward proved both efficient and fractious. Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset and the new Lord Protector, moved swiftly to revive the reforms Henry VIII had championed, in particular further consolidation of royal lands and expansion of the Protestant faith. Somerset issued proclamations limiting Mass, banning certain images in churches, and encouraging English translations of the Bible. He flouted Henry's will in crucial areas. Noble land grants were reduced, and taxes on the gentry increased to fund his wars in Scotland. In Scotland, King James V had died only weeks before Henry, on December 14, 1542, leaving his infant daughter Mary as queen. Somerset seized the opportunity to enforce the rough wooing, an aggressive campaign to force a marriage between Edward VI and Mary, Queen of Scots. English forces marched north, burning towns and carrying off supplies. Scots rallied in resistance. Border skirmishes claimed more lives in 6 months than Henry's entire French wars had in years. The specter of another foreign conflict proved that Henry's belligerence outlived him. By midsummer 1547, Edward VI's England felt the shockwaves of regency policy. Sheep tax, once minimal, had doubled. Farmers near York found their tithes confiscated in the name of royal debt repayment. Meanwhile, monasteries dissolved by Henry VIII, Grey Friars in Beverley, Fountains Abbey near Ripon, were stripped bare, their stones sold, and local alms pools diverted to the crown. Public charity, long a staple of monastic generosity, dwindled. The poor turned to parish overseers, now overwhelmed by the flood of destitute ex-monks and laypeople. Still, the councillors justified this ruthlessness as necessary to stabilize England after years of personal monarchy. They pointed to the king's will, where Henry had insisted on a firm hand to enforce discipline. They praised Edward VI as holy and learned, a boy destined to surpass both his father and his half-brother, the deposed Richard II. But behind closed doors, divisions ran deep. Conservatives longed for the Mass and traditional liturgy. Reformers sought to purge all lingering papist practices. Somerset's iron decree that communion tables replace altars and that priests marry set rural parishes ablaze with dissent. The past Henry VIII built on faith but bent to his will. His successors now unraveled and restitched the ecclesiastical tapestry in even more radical ways. Meanwhile, Henry's succession had unleashed a wave of cultural reevaluation. Poets and chroniclers turned their pens to his tumultuous reign. John Foxe, soon to publish his monumental Book of Martyrs, dedicated a chapter to Henry's brutality toward those who defended Rome and to his harsh persecution of Protestants only when politically expedient. Thomas Churchyard, who had known the king's joust, recalled Henry's stern majesty, tempered by sudden flames of temper, yet capable of friendship unshaken by treason's whisper. The legends multiplied, stories of hidden letters from Anne Boleyn, secret oaths sworn on Jane Seymour's deathbed, and the ghostly clank of Henry's armor rattling in the chapel aisles at midnight. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Henry's death and life was the transformation of kingship itself. He had shattered the medieval ideal of a divine, distant monarch, replacing it with an image of the king as absolute ruler, head of church and state. His death dramatized the vulnerability of that power. His heirs would find that the throne he forged was also a cage of expectation. Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I would each wrestle with the Tudor inheritance, a nation newly independent from Rome, burdened by royal debt and riven by religious identity. Edward's reign ended tragically in 1553 when he fell ill, possibly tuberculosis or a contracting fever from continued border wars, and succumbed at 16. His death sparked a succession crisis that saw Lady Jane Grey proclaimed queen for 9 days before Mary I, Henry VIII's Catholic daughter by Catherine of Aragon, seized the throne. Mary's bloody re-Catholicization, burning hundreds at the stake, was both revenge against her father's reformation and proof that Henry's legacy could be twisted in opposite directions. Mary's death in 1558 ushered in Elizabeth I, who wisely navigated between extremes to create the Elizabethan settlement. Yet every compromise bore Henry's imprint, the monarch who demanded the right to annul marriage, to dissolve monasteries, and to tax at will. Elizabeth's act of supremacy in 1559 echoed her father's own break with Rome, declaring the monarch head of church and state once more, but this time with a more measured approach to liturgy and ritual. Around Europe, Henry's death aged like a turning point in history. In France, the Valois kings watched England's religious civil war with alarm. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, at once Henry's brother-in-law, lamented the loss of his former ally, even as he condemned the English king's flip-flop allegiance between Rome and Wittenberg. Papal historians portrayed Henry as the poster child of regal hubris, a cautionary tale about a king who dared to depose a pope and who died rotting in his bed. In the centuries that followed, the grotesque details of Henry's demise faded from polite conversation, sanitized beneath layers of state propaganda and palace chroniclers, keen to present a sanitized, heroic Tudor dynasty. His physical horrors, ulcerated legs, weight-ridden belly, gout-twisted limbs, became footnotes. Teachers spoke of his 6 marriages, his break with Rome, his patronage of the arts. Only in recent decades, as historians delved into medical records, personal letters, and the accounts of foreign ambassadors, has the full spectacle of his body's collapse reclaimed its place in the narrative of Tudor England. And perhaps that's fitting. Henry VIII wanted to control every aspect of his image. He crafted golden tombs, statues in Florence, portraits by Holbein and Lucas Cranach, but the reality of his flesh refused to be painted over. His body became the final authority on his mortality, forcing all who saw him, servant and sovereign alike, to confront the universal truth that no crown can stave off decay. Today, when visitors wander St. George's Chapel at Windsor, they look upon Henry's ornate effigy, head crowned, hand raised in blessing, armor pristine, and they seldom imagine the man beneath that marble idol, whose flesh melted away in agonizing detail. His tomb is a triumph of Renaissance artistry. His corpse was a testament to medieval medicine's limits. Both remain, side by side, a dual monument to power and mortality. In the end, The horrible death of Henry VIII serves as a mirror, reflecting the grandeur of a king who reshaped a nation and the fragility of the human body that underpinned every decreed law and bloody conquest. He once declared himself the oceanic prince, whose waves of authority would lap upon every corner of Christendom. Instead, his final wave crashed in a swell of pus and splintered bone, a stark reminder that even kings, for all their gilded pomp, lie vulnerable to the worm and the rot. And that is the ultimate lesson of Henry's end. No matter how vast the kingdom, no matter how lofty the crown, the sovereign must one day surrender to the most basic of truths. His death was not a quiet passing in a four-poster bed of roses, but a prolonged agony that stripped away all pretense. It was an unflinching revelation that, in the face of mortality, the divine right of kings meets its match in the slow, inexorable collapse of the flesh. May we remember him not only for the splendor he unleashed in life, but for the grim final chapter he authored in death, a spectacle so personal, so visceral, that it transcends history and speaks to our own fragile condition. In that sense, Henry VIII's corpse outlasts every stone monument, for it remains the most potent testament to the ultimate equalizer. Death, undignified and unstoppable, brushing aside crowns and codpieces alike, leaving behind only the echoes of power and the stains of humanity. Hey guys, picture this. The ruler of an empire so vast that the sun never set on it, brought low by his own flesh, worms writhing through festering sores as he gasped for breath in a dark Madrid chamber. Bone-chilling, right? Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. From the moment Philip of Spain drew his first breath on May 21st, 1527 in Valladolid, destiny conspired to place him at the epicenter of European power. Son of Emperor Charles V and Isabella of Portugal, the infant prince arrived amid the clang of armor and the muted hush of courtly intrigue. His christening was a spectacle, gold bowls of rosewater, trumpets serenading the nave, and ambassadors from Venice, England, and the Ottoman Porte vying to bestow gifts on the future most Catholic majesty. Even as a child, Philip displayed a gravity beyond his years. Portraits later commissioned by his court show a solemn boy in black velvet, features hard as carved marble. At 5, he sat for lessons in Latin, theology, and statecraft under the watchful eyes of humanist tutors. By 8, he was fluent in 4 tongues. By 12, he negotiated political marriages and letters between Madrid and Brussels. While other princes played games of tilt and tournament, Philip was forced to study maps outlining the Spanish Netherlands, the Italian kingdoms, and the New World holdings streaming into Seville's docks. When his grandfather, Ferdinand of Aragon, died in 1516, Philip's father inherited the crowns of Spain, the Low Countries, Naples, and Sicily, as well as the imperial dignity of Charles V. The young prince learned early that empire meant constant war, against the Turco-Ottoman frontier, rival French claimants and fractious German princes upset at imperial taxation. In 1543, at 16, Philip was crowned King of England and Ireland by proxy, married to the widowed Queen Mary I, though the union produced no heir. Yet even this diplomatic achievement failed to ease his father's burdens. Charles V's incessant conflicts drained the royal treasury and tested the patience of weary Castilian subjects. Philip's marriage alliance with Mary Therese of Austria in 1543 cemented Habsburg unity, but his real schooling was in the cracks between the palace walls. He watched courtiers whisper against each other, alliances shift with each coin spent, and diplomats fan the flames of rebellion in the Netherlands. These early lessons carved ambition into his soul. He would rule alone, with an iron will unclouded by faction. In 1556, faced with illness and the exhausting demands of empire, Charles V abdicated, leaving Philip master of the world's largest realm. The young king, aged 29, stepped onto his father's ornate throne in the Escorial Palace, surrounded by golden reliquaries and chants of vespers. He was proclaimed Philip II, defender of Catholicism, scourge of heresy, and guardian of Christendom's most sacred treasures. For years he wore these titles like armor. He centralized administration under strict councils, finance in Valladolid, war in Toledo, Flanders and Brussels. He instituted a royal mail service stretching from Madrid to Mexico City. His capital, once dusty Toledo, shifted to Madrid, a city he ordered paved and built up with plazas, monasteries, and his monumental palace monastery at El Escorial, whose austere granite lines reflected his own piety and discipline. Yet even as he projected unwavering might, Philip's body began to betray him. Court physicians noted the first signs in the 1560s, a subtle swelling of the ankles after lengthy audiences, stiffness in the joints from prayer vigils that stretched into the night, and a persistent cough, dismissed as a mild respiratory complaint. Philip bore these infirmities with stoic resignation. He rebuffed any suggestion of rest or diversion. Instead, he doubled down on his regimen of 5 masses a day, fasting until sundown on Fridays, and nightly examinations of his soul by the Jesuit confessors he held dear. But the burdens of empire weighed heavily on his health. The disastrous naval defeat at Lepanto in 1571, the grinding siege of the Netherlands, and the looming conflict with Protestant England over the Mary, Queen of Scots affair. Each crisis drove him to sleepless councils and midnight dispatches. He subsisted on thin broth and Spanish wine, refusing fruit or vegetables as frivolous. When he ate, it was only game birds glazed in dripping fat, hearty bread soaked in red Rioja, and just enough cheese to silence hunger pangs. By the mid-1570s, his gout flared with alarming frequency. His knees locked in place, forcing him to use ornate crutches carved with Habsburg emblems. He blamed court intrigue, poor air in the palace, or God's chastisement for his sins. But secretly, his diet, untold quantities of salted ham, wild boar, and almonds, was at war with his body. Court physicians resorted to leeches on his calves and doses of mercurial ointment on his temples, all to no avail. Even so, Philip maintained his imperial gaze. From his study window in El Escorial, he looked north to the Low Countries with a furrowed brow. Revolt there had burned since 1566. Rebel armies swept Francis Drake's privateers through Cadiz, and the munitions factory at Antwerp sent shipments of gunpowder to every Protestant cause. To each threat, Philip replied with edicts, bans, and declarations of excommunication. He marshaled the Spanish Armada in 1588, convinced the winds and tides would carry his gold-laden galleons to the English Channel and secure his dominion forever. Instead, plague and overconfidence betrayed him. Mustered crews complained of scurvy and dysentery before even rounding the Bay of Biscay. Silver cannons burst on first use. Inexperienced sailors careened drunkenly through the rigging. When the Armada finally set sail, a combination of storms, fire ships, and English long-range cannon sent Philip's pride and treasure floundering. More than half his fleet perished in the North Atlantic, corpses washing ashore in Ireland and Scotland, their bloated bodies testament to royal overreach. That disaster cracked something in the king's spirit. He retreated. No longer did he rise before dawn to read dispatches. He cut back on confessions, choosing silence over the comfort of the confessional booth. The gout grew worse. Now his hands trembled as he attempted to sign decrees. Physicians diagnosed dropsy, fluid building around his heart and lungs. He refused to use an adjustable chair, crowing instead, "A king must stand even when he cannot." He ordered his courtiers to carry him to mass on a litter, sprinkled with censers of incense to conceal his labored breathing. In 1590, tragedy struck close to home. His beloved wife, Elizabeth of Valois, died of fever, leaving him bereft. He wrote in anguished Latin, "Nihil est durius quam cordis incendium quod non extinguitur." The court allowed itself a moment of collective pity for the monarch who ruled half the world, yet could not save his queen. But Philip steeled himself once more, pouring his grief into final campaigns in France and the Netherlands. By 1595, his feet were painfully clawed with gout, his legs swollen grotesquely. Bed sores festered on his back after long days in rigid repose. Attempts to drain the fluid yielded only a thin yellow discharge, an unmistakable sign of infection. Physicians whispered of the black death of flesh, but dared not voice it to Philip's face. So they applied strong cedar oil and wine, wrapped his limbs in coarse linen, and hoped God would perform a miracle. All the while, the monarch began to brood on mortality. He commissioned funeral effigies, waxen likenesses of himself dressed in full parade armor, with hands clasped in prayer. He wrote his own epitaph in meticulous detail, requesting a simple tomb on the Escorial hillside, facing west toward the setting sun. He instructed that his body be washed in rosewater and clothed in the habit of the Order of St. Jerome. And yet, the worst was yet to come. In early 1598, Philip awoke one February morning unable to move his legs. The fluid in his abdomen pressed so hard he could not breathe without pain. His lips turned blue. Court Jesuits gathered around his bed, chanting psalms for the dying. He nodded feebly as if signaling approval of the liturgy, but in the dank gloom of his chamber, the subtle horror of decay had already begun. In the folds of his groin, where bed linens chafed and ointment could not penetrate, minute ulcerations opened like black flowers. They wept a foul, greenish liquid. No ointment quelled their hunger, no prayer turned aside the rot. And in those small, festering hollows, maggots found nourishment, millions of tiny white worms burrowing into the flesh of Spain's greatest king. Philip felt them. In sleepless delirium, he would yank at his sheets, crying, "Vai mihi," as he imagined armies of worms undermining his flesh. Physicians attempted to scrape them away with steel spatulas, then cauterized the wound with hot oil. The king shrieked with each application, sweat and blood mingling with the oily purge. The stench of maggots and infection crept through the palace halls, and courtiers dared not venture near his chamber without masks of linen steeped in vinegar. In these weeks, Philip's empire showed its own fractures. Financial collapse loomed as silver shipments from the Americas dwindled. The Duke of Parma begged for more troops in the Netherlands. The Viceroy of Naples pleaded for relief from Ottoman corsairs. But all of Spain's power could not staunch the rot in one man's body. From his bed, Philip signed letters with a careless flourish, barely conscious of their content. When couriers arrived, they found him slumped in the pillows, eyes fixed on a crucifix that hung just inches from his lips. This was not a monarch's end with regal dignity. He did not slip quietly into the eternal night. Instead, Philip endured a slow dismantling of flesh by the countless worms feasting on his living tissue. Each moment was agony, each breath a labor. His attendants held basins and cloths, ever vigilant for fresh discharge. Candles guttered in the damp air, their wavering light casting grotesque shadows on the stone walls. And so, we leave Philip II of Spain on the brink of his final descent, an empire still humming with activity beyond his bedchamber, while within, the monarch himself faced the most primal horror of all, the slow, inexorable devouring of his own body, from the inside out. By the spring of 1598, the great halls of El Escorial had fallen silent. Once echoing with the clatter of courtiers and the toll of chapel bells, the monastery palace now reverberated only with the muted drip of poultice-soaked dressings and the low moans of its master. Philip II, sovereign of an empire spanning 4 continents, lay confined to a narrow iron-framed bed, every sinew locked in torturous rigidity. The maggots multiplied. In the dark folds of his groin and the creases behind his knees, where the finest linens could not reach, these diminutive invaders feasted unchecked. Physicians, their stiffness betraying horror, maintained a daily ritual, the scraping, as they called it, in which steel spatulas were slid beneath the living flesh to dislodge the writhing larvae. Philip, strapped to the bed by grim necessity, would scream and claw at the air, eyes wild beneath the silvered hair of his temples. One attendant later confessed that the king's shrieks rose like cannon fire across the silent courtyard. Despite this agony, state business pressed on. From his bedside, Philip summoned ambassadors by messenger to negotiate with Queen Elizabeth, who clung to uneasy peace in England, to press his claim on Portugal, newly vacated by the childless King Sebastian, to demand subsidies from the viceroys. In Mexico and Peru, he signed edicts in his own blood-tinged hand, stamping letters with the royal seal that bore the Habsburg eagle. Each signature was a struggle, his trembling fist guided by a trembling mind, and yet none dared refuse or delay. On March 3rd, the Council of State convened hastily in the Sala de los Borbón. News had arrived that the Ottoman fleet had raided Crete, and the Venetians implored Spanish aid. The councillors prostrated themselves before Philip's open door, clutching dispatches stamped with olive oil and sea salt. The king's voice, when it emerged, was a rasp. "Dispatch the armada of the Levant. Let the crescent see our banner once more." The order, scribbled by a pale secretary, cost Philip so much effort that he collapsed into delirium afterward, his breath rattling like a withered reed. As April waned, the monarch's strength ebbed further. His weight dropped dramatically, hollowed cheeks pulling taut over cheekbones. Gout, once restricted to his knees and feet, now spread to his wrists, immobilizing the quill even as state papers multiplied. Physicians recorded his pulse as thready and intermittent, a death rattle waiting to be born. They applied compresses of rose petals and laurel oil, hoping to staunch the flow of his corrupted blood. When those failed, they turned to more drastic measures, cauterizing irons brandished above his flesh as though to incinerate the worms themselves. The screams that followed echoed through the granite corridors, driving novices from their prayers and monks from their cells. In these final weeks, Philip sank into feverish dreams. He saw vast fields of orange groves aflame, the trees groaning as if under siege. He heard the distant roar of cannons in Flanders and remembered the moment when, in his youth, he watched Antwerp burn at Alexander Farnese's command. He saw Mary, Queen of Scots, her face pale behind a guillotine shadow. He felt the bones of his ancestors beneath him, their judicial robes pressing against his spine, delivering verdict after verdict for sins committed centuries before. On May 12, 1598, word came that his sister Joanna, imprisoned for madness in the Alcazar of Tordesillas, had died. Practically born a Queen of Castile in her own right, Joanna had never ruled. Philip, brother guardian and reluctant jailer, wept for the first time in public remembrance. Courtiers dared to hope this emotion might herald some softening, some final grace in the king's harried spirit, but grief only deepened his collapse. He refused food for 2 days, surviving on nothing but water and fleeting visions of Joanna's sorrowful eyes. By early June, the worms had burrowed beyond the outer layers of skin, working their way toward muscle and bone. Physicians whispered of mallesis profunda, a horror they had read about but never witnessed on a monarch. The smell became overpowering, a rancid sweetness mixed with the metallic tang of blood. Courtiers claimed they could identify Philip's chamber from yards away, the stench hanging like a cloud over the palace moat. King and empire spiraled together. In the Netherlands, Maurice of Nassau pressed his Protestant revolt with renewed vigor, sensing the Habsburg backbone weakening. English pirates, emboldened by Elizabeth's tacit support, raided Spanish treasure fleets off Cadiz while financial coffers ran dry. Rumors of bankruptcy spread through Seville's merchant quarters. Conspiracies formed in the shadowed taverns of Burgos. Advisors begged Philip to name his successor officially, to spare the empire another interregnum, but the king could not find the strength to sign even a simple will. On June 28th, his 71st birthday, Philip received the last rites in his bedchamber chapel. Jesuit confessors intoned prayers as he clutched a silver crucifix to his parched lips. He whispered a confession so faint that even the closest could not discern the words. Though many swore he named each crusade, each siege, each broken treaty in his catalogue of sins. When the final absolution came, a hush engulfed the monastery. The sound of censing incense faded, replaced by the near inaudible drip of droplet after droplet from his wound. That night, the worms reached his torso. Under the cover of darkness, the larvae crept beneath the heavy brocade of his robe, exploring warmth where no surgeon's blade could follow. King and flesh became indistinguishable, a royal body riddled with caverns of decay. He coughed up small clots of blood, each expectoration a reminder that the battle for his lungs was lost. Servants placed basins at his side, collecting loathsome fluids that once would have been unthinkable in the royal presence. As July dawned, Philip's condition deteriorated to a single monotonous state, a semi-conscious drifting between pain and stupor. He no longer spoke, no longer signed decrees. A single gesture, a feeble lift of his hand, was interpreted by courtiers as confirmation of some midnight policy. In truth, his mind wandered through past glories, the triumph at Lepanto, the marriage to Mary the Friend of England, the whitewashing of classical ruins in Rome. He saw the face of Elizabeth of Valois and wintered in the bitterness of her memory. On July 18, 1598, the physicians conceded defeat. In solemn conclave, they pronounced that nothing remained to prolong his life. The king, they said, had outlived his usefulness even to his own flesh. Word was sent to the Council of State. The monarch was beyond recovery. Panic rippled through the chambers of power. Estates of nobles were hurriedly sealed, treaties left unsigned, ambassadors recalled in terror of a leaderless Spain. And yet, Philip's last act of authority unfolded in silence. On July 22nd, he made a final feeble mark on a document sending reinforcements to Sicily against the Ottoman threat, his handwriting nearly illegible, smudged by sweat and blood. The scribe, tears welling in his eyes, bowed and raised the pen as though it were a scepter. Then, with a final tremor, the king closed his eyes and exhaled in a sound more like the slip of a broken hinge than a human breath. He did not shout, he did not curse, he did not weep. He simply stopped breathing. The worms, denied further movement, lay dormant in the cold, silent carcass of the greatest monarch his empire had ever known. On July 23, 1598, the royal herald proclaimed Philip II, King of Spain and Portugal, Naples and Sicily, the Indies and the New World, Earl of Flanders and of Tyrol, Duke of Milan and Burgundy, Defender of the Faith, is dead. In the Plaza Mayor of Arcs, Madrid, bells tolled for an hour. Citizens held vigils by candlelight, some praying for his soul, others quietly rejoicing at the end of his endless wars. Yet the spectacle of Philip's death was not complete. Preparations began for his embalming, a ritual destined to rival any of his grandest triumphs. Embalmers, summoned from Seville's guild, arrived with satchels of myrrh, cinnamon, and powdered camphor. They worked through the night, draining the body of its putrid fluids, stuffing cavities with aromatic spices in hopes of arresting decay. But the worms, those tenacious intruders, survived the initial purge. After the body was washed and wrapped, small white wriggles were seen emerging from the bandages. Horrified attendants recoiled as the embalmers revealed the truth. Maggots burrowed into the heart and liver, feasting on tissue no preservative could touch. The spices burned their nostrils but could not kill the larvae hidden deep within. One embalmist, overcome by disgust, collapsed in a heap, his leather gloves turning slick with gore. In the grip of panic, the royal surgeons enacted a desperate course. They reopened sealed incisions, turned the body every hour to drain fluids, and repacked the chest with fresh cinnamon bark. The stench lifted marginally, but the worms were driven deeper in search of warmth. Courtiers, standing guard by the corpse, wore masks of brocade and metal, fearing contagion. Some swore they saw writhing shapes beneath the linen, as though the spirit of decay refused to be exorcised. By August 1st, the body was deemed sufficiently dignified for the grand procession to the Escorial Pantheon. The coffin, reinforced with iron bands and cedar planks, was wheeled through Madrid streets in a funeral cortege of unparalleled splendor. Nobles rode black chargers, their banners at half-mast. Clergy chanted psalms in Latin and Spanish. Yet underlying the pomp, a darker current flowed, the scent of Philip's corruption, faint but undeniable, trailing behind the hearse like an unseen specter. When the coffin was finally laid in the royal crypt of the Pantheon de los Reyes on the night of August 3rd, the elite gasped at the grotesque final tableau. Spice shrouds draped the bier. Layers of purple velvet hid the pyre of smells beneath. But as the wax candles guttered and died, those standing closest swore they heard a soft, wet pop, a last escape of life from the monarch's storied reign. Thus ended the corporeal journey of Philip II. From the confident young prince of 1556 to the worm-ridden sovereign of 1598, his life had spanned wars, marriages, sieges, and crusades, and yet his death was defined by the most primitive of forces, decay. The empire he built outlasted his flesh, but the horror of those final months lingered in whispered court gossip and in the unpublished diaries of palace servants. In leaving his body to the worms, Philip II unwittingly penned his own epitaph, an emperor whose greatest conquest was over foreign lands, but who could not command even his own flesh to endure. His legacy, cast in marble and granite at El Escorial, would stand for centuries as a testament to Habsburg might. Yet beneath the stone, in the dark crypt, lay the true remnant of his reign, bones hollowed by rot, nourished by worms, and forever silent. In the somber months following Philip II's gruesome passing, Spain awoke to a realm unmoored. The king's coffin may have sealed his flesh beneath El Escorial's granite vaults, but the rot he left behind had infested every corner of his empire. As birdsong rose above Madrid's slate roofs, courtiers and commoners alike grappled with a world without the grim authority who had once bound them with fear and faith. The sudden power vacuum. The week after Philip's death, the Council of State, reduced now to its most ruthless members, scrambled to fill the void. Archduke Albert of Austria, Philip's nephew, was summoned from Brussels. Don Juan of Austria, the king's illegitimate half-brother and hero of Lepanto, arrived from Naples. Together, they jockeyed for the regency of Spain's young heir, Philip III, just shy of his 14th birthday. Each faction claimed legitimacy, Albert with Habsburg blood, Juan with military glory. Meanwhile, the states of Aragon and Castile, long subject to Philip II's iron will, saw an opportunity to reclaim privileges suppressed under his centralizing rule. In Seville, merchants whispered of lower taxes and freer trade, daring to hope the new regime would ease burdens on commerce. In Valencia, once suppressed Moriscos, Muslims forced to convert, risked covert communion again, banking on a weaker crown to turn a blind eye. In the Netherlands, the 12 years' truce of 1609 seemed within reach, provided Spain could muster a consistent policy. Yet as each region pressed its claim, the fractured Council of State found itself entangled in endless debate rather than decisive action. The result, months of paralysis, punctuated only by half-hearted proclamations promising reforms that never materialized. Philip III's inheritance of decay, crowned as Philip III in April 1599. The teenager barely registered his own accession. With his father's maggot-ridden corpse still whispered about in palace corridors, the youth steered clear of state matters. Instead, real power slipped into the hands of the Duke of Lerma, a favorite who rose from court obscurity to become the king's valido, chief minister. Lerma's sudden enrichment and monopoly on royal patronage mirrored the worst of Philip II's own nepotism, but without the same iron discipline. Under Lerma, Spain's finances crumbled further. The silver fleets from Veracruz and Potosi trickled in, but payoffs to the Duke, massive embezzlement, and a string of bankruptcies forced 3 state bankruptcies between 1607 and 1619. Habsburg grandeur gave way to empty royal treasuries, unpaid soldiers, and a wave of peasant uprisings in Andalusia and Galicia. Chroniclers blamed Philip III's idleness and indulgence, but the rot began under his father's watch. A kingdom built on foreign treasure and endless war, now starved of both. The long shadow of worm-ridden power. As news of Philip II's final affliction seeped outward, it became a political weapon. Protestant pamphleteers in Amsterdam circulated lurid broadsheets depicting the dead king's worms as divine judgment on Spanish tyranny. In England, courtiers raised toasts to Elizabeth I, mocking the maggot king who had so nearly extinguished her realm. Even within Spain, satirical verses circulated among university students. The worms that dined in Madrid's sun now feast on empire, undone. Though treasonous in tone, the poems spread rapidly, a reminder that the king's physical humiliation had become everyone's political game. Ghost stories in the haunting of El Escorial legend claims that within weeks of Philip II's burial, strange phenomena arose at the newly completed monastery palace. Choir boys rehearsing vespers in the basilica heard scraping sounds echoing beneath the marble floors. Guards stationed in the dim crypt swore they glimpsed a pale figure draped in royal robes crawling through the corridors, his mouth stained with gore, his eyes gaping. Pilgrims visiting the king's tomb reported chills, sudden gusts of wind, and the faint odor of decay in the cool granite air. One tale tells of a monk who dared to open Philip's vault in hopes of retrieving relics for the chapel. Upon lifting the heavy lid, he recoiled as a faint scratching erupted from within. Believing the worm still clung to the rotted corpse, he slammed the stone shut, blackened his sanity, and took vow of silence. Others claim that at midnight every Friday, the day Philip had most vehemently insisted on morning rituals, a low moan drifts upward from the crypt, as if the monarch's tortured spirit remains trapped within. Spain's slow decline in the toll of overreach, the political and supernatural echoes of Philip II's death dovetailed with Spain's real decline. The once unstoppable Habsburg Armada dwindled to a handful of decrepit galleons. Colonial administrations stretched thin from Mexico to Manila, faced rebellion and corruption. Silver mines in Peru flooded local economies, triggering inflation so severe that by 1600, a gold ducat bought a fraction of what it had in Philip II's youth. Meanwhile, rival powers rose. England's East India Company sailed with impunity through the Strait of Magellan. The Dutch West India Company carved out sugar colonies in Brazil. France, under the Bourbon dynasty, consolidated control of the Mediterranean. Spain's European allies grew uneasy. The Holy Roman Empire, entangled in the 30 Years' War, begged for Habsburg support. Yet Madrid's coffers were empty, its armies half-starved and demoralized. Historians' reappraisal, from madman to flawed genius. For centuries, Philip II's reign was cast in black and white terms: avenger of the Reformation, champion of Catholicism, oppressor of the Low Countries. More recently, scholars have peeled back layers of propaganda and miasma to see a monarch both visionary and tragically flawed. His grand bureaucratic reforms, creation of the Council of Finance, modernization of Spain's navy, standardization of coinage, are now recognized as the foundation of a modern state. But those same reforms bred inflexibility, fractious regionalism, and the moral hazard of unchecked ministerial power. Medical historians have likewise revisited Philip's final months. Analyzing contemporary accounts and exhumation reports from the 18th century, they suggest he suffered chronic venous insufficiency, aggravated by cirrhosis from years of heavy drinking. The maggot infestation was likely a severe case of cutaneous meiosis, enabled by poor hygiene and lack of systemic antibiotics. In this light, the worms become less a divine curse than a symptom of an empire that neglected its own well-being in pursuit of glory. Echoes in popular culture. In the 19th century, Spanish romantics rediscovered Philip's tortured legend. Poets wrote brooding sonnets about the worm-eaten king. Painters depicted his gaunt effigy with crawling vermin, and playwrights staged masks in which Philip's ghost demanded vengeance. More recently, filmmakers have dramatized his final hours, garnering both acclaim and controversy for their graphic realism. The story endures because it speaks to something primal: the fragility of power and the inevitability of decay, the final lesson of the worm-ridden monarch. As the centuries have rolled on, historians and storytellers alike have returned to Philip II's deathbed, not merely for sensationalism, but for the stark moral it offers. A king who commanded half the known world could not command his own body. The worms that feasted on his flesh mirrored the internal rot of an empire too vast to govern, too proud to adapt. His death stands as a warning that no matter how great a ruler's achievements, the ultimate arbiter remains the slow, merciless triumph of nature over ambition. The reign of Philip II began with an empire bathed in gold and ended with a monarch bathed in his own rot. And while his body decayed in private, the memory of his rule continued to decay in public. Spain had entered a long twilight, and the worm-ridden king remained both its symbol and its warning. The afterlife of a corpse. After Philip's burial at El Escorial, the monastery palace he had personally designed, his corpse didn't rest easily. The crypt, cold and ornate, held generations of Habsburg monarchs, each embalmed with varying degrees of success. But Philip's body, ravaged by infection and already partially decomposed before burial, was infamous among royal undertakers. Within weeks, attendants reported fluid seeping from the marble tomb. Some believed it was condensation, others whispered it was royal ichor, a final offering to the stones he'd once walked. In truth, the embalming had failed. Reports claimed that even in death, Philip's body bloated and split, the worms within continuing their grim banquet. One anonymous monk scribbled in his diary that the king's flesh turned to a vile soup before our Lord could receive his soul. When Philip III visited the crypt a year later, he refused to stand near his father's vault. He had the entire area sealed in incense and consecrated oils, more to mask the stench than to honor the divine. The legacy of fear. For decades, Philip II had ruled by fear, of God, of sin, of rebellion, and of his own father's ghost. Now, his own specter haunted Spain's collective memory. In villages, people told tales of a pale horse that roamed the roads on stormy nights, bearing a skeletal rider whose breath reeked of death and whose crown was crawling with worms. Children were warned to behave, lest King Philip's worms come for you. These weren't just spooky bedtime stories. They reflected the trauma of living under a regime where heresy was punished by fire and dissent by exile. The Inquisition, once his favorite instrument, began to lose credibility. Trials became spectacles, but fewer took them seriously. Even priests began questioning whether Spain's spiritual purity was worth the toll in lives, freedom, and sanity. El Escorial as tomb and temple. Philip's grand project, El Escorial, was meant to be both a palace and a gateway to heaven, but in the years after his death, it became a shrine to overreach. Maintenance faltered. The once pristine halls grew cold and dark. The library, once home to thousands of rare manuscripts, fell into neglect as Spain's intellectuals fled to more tolerant lands. Visitors arrived expecting grandeur and left chilled. Guides whispered of strange noises at night, chains dragging, whispering voices, and the occasional distant moan. A rumor spread that no bird would land on the spires, and no animal would enter the crypt willingly. El Escorial was no longer a palace, it was a mausoleum. Decline in the Americas. Across the Atlantic, the colonial empire Philip had micromanaged from his gloomy study began to drift. Governors who once feared the king's wrath now ruled like mini-monarchs. Corruption bloomed. In New Spain, silver shipments grew lighter with each voyage, and entire galleons were rumored lost to piracy or intentional misdirection. Native revolts grew more frequent. Without Philip's obsessive oversight, brutal encomienda systems collapsed under their own cruelty. Missionaries, once protected by royal edict, found themselves caught between rebellious locals and greedy Spanish landowners. The dream of a pious empire converting the world faded. What remained was greed, mismanagement, and disease. The worms of Europe. On the European front, Spain's enemies sensed weakness. The Dutch, who had long fought against Philip's brutal repression in the Low Countries, gained ground. Their naval power surged, while Spain's fleets, once the terror of the seas, rusted in port or sank under the weight of poor design and poorer planning. England, now under James I, extended trade routes into Asia and the New World, cutting into Spanish monopolies. France, rising from its religious wars, asserted itself as a counterbalance to Habsburg dominance. Even the Ottoman Empire, long held in check by Philip's Mediterranean strategy, began probing Spanish defenses once more. The worms that had feasted on Philip's legs now feasted symbolically on his empire. Bit by bit, the vast machinery he had built began to break. Philip III's failure. Unlike his father, Philip III lacked drive. He delegated everything to the Duke of Lerma, who enriched himself while Spain's economy collapsed. The royal court became a festival of excess and incompetence. Taxes rose, famine spread, and plague followed. Cities depopulated, rural areas reverted to feudal chaos. Even the once mighty Spanish army fell apart. Mercenaries went unpaid, and discipline broke down. Battles were lost not because of strategy, but because soldiers simply deserted. Spain was no longer feared, it was pitied. The final insult. In 1621, Philip III died of illness in the same El Escorial that had entombed his father. His reign was so ineffectual that most Spaniards barely noticed. His corpse was interred near Philip II's, and once again the embalming failed. Attendants reported signs of decay within days, and the familiar scent of death returned to the crypt. Some whispered that the worms had come again, that the sins of the father were now devouring the son. Others claimed it was simply a sign from God that the Habsburgs were cursed. Historical reckoning. Today, Philip II is a paradox. To some, he remains a brilliant administrator who tried to impose order on chaos. To others, he's a tyrant who choked his empire with fear, war, and religious fanaticism. His death, bloated, infected, and consumed by worms, has become a potent metaphor for the fate of empires that ignore the human cost of power. He sought immortality through faith and legacy. What he achieved was a cautionary tale, that even the mightiest king cannot escape decay, and that the worms waiting in the dark come for all. The question now is not what Philip II accomplished, but what he cost, and whether the empire he built was worth the price of his body and soul. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a queen whose death was so undignified, so human, and so bizarre that it borders on historical satire. This is the story of Catherine of Valois, royal bride, reluctant pawn, and possibly the only monarch in history whose tragic downfall may have involved holding in a fart for way too long. Let's begin not with Catherine's end, but with her world, a realm of thrones, treaties, and some of the worst hygiene standards medieval medicine had to offer. Born in 1401, Catherine of Valois arrived into the French royal court as the youngest daughter of Charles VI, aka Charles the Mad, and Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, whose own reputation was one half scandal, one half survival. Catherine was royalty from birth, but her early years were far from golden. Her father's mental instability wasn't just a family matter, it destabilized France. Charles VI believed he was made of glass, occasionally forgot he was king, and often ran screaming through his palaces trying to avoid invisible enemies. His fits of madness meant that the Valois court was always on edge, its politics unpredictable and its princesses, like Catherine, relegated to the background. While her brothers jostled for power and her mother was accused of everything from adultery to witchcraft, young Catherine was largely forgotten, left to stew in royal obscurity. Her childhood was spent not in luxury, but in waiting for someone to decide what to do with her, waiting for someone to marry her off, and perhaps waiting for her intestines to rebel. Because here's the thing, medieval life was a constant struggle against digestive discomfort. The food, heavy, the hygiene, non-existent, the medical knowledge, lethal. Combine all that with court etiquette that demanded queens behave like porcelain saints, and you have a recipe for gastrointestinal disaster. As Catherine came of age, England and France were locked in one of history's longest political squabbles, the 100 Years' War. Enter Henry V of England, war hero, heartthrob, and a man who thought invading France was a romantic gesture. After smashing the French at Agincourt in 1415, Henry turned his eyes not just to the crown of France, but to Catherine herself. To seal peace, the Treaty of Troyes was signed in 1420. Its terms, brutal for the French. Henry would marry Catherine, inherit the French throne upon Charles VI's death, and France would effectively become an English possession. For Catherine, this meant her body was now a political chess piece, and her digestive health? Still not a priority. The royal wedding took place with all the pomp and pageantry of a high-stakes hostage exchange. Catherine, at just 18, was married off to a man she barely knew, in a ceremony that had more to do with conquest than love. Still, there are reports that she and Henry got along reasonably well. He wasn't cruel, just focused on war, politics, and occasionally on his wife. They had one son, the future Henry VI, and for a brief moment, Catherine might have believed she was finally secure. But Henry V, like most medieval kings, had a habit of dying inconveniently. In 1422, just 2 years after their wedding, Henry dropped dead of dysentery, a fancy word for explosive death by dehydration and diarrhea. Catherine was widowed, with an infant son and a kingdom in crisis. Now, most queens would retreat to a convent or quietly fade into royal widowhood. But Catherine? She had other plans. Enter Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier with a questionable job description and very few royal connections. He was, by all accounts, charming, handsome, and good at catching the queen's eye when no one was looking. The romance between Catherine and Owen was dangerous, not because of scandal, but because the English court was paranoid. Parliament, fearing she might remarry a noble and create a rival power base, passed laws effectively banning her from marrying without permission. Catherine responded by marrying Owen Tudor anyway, probably in secret, possibly without even telling her own son. They had several children together, and their descendants would go on to found the Tudor dynasty. But Catherine's secret happiness was short-lived. Her health began to decline rapidly in her mid-30s, and here's where the digestive tragedy begins in earnest. Reports from the time mention abdominal pain, swelling, and blocked humors, which is medieval for something's wrong but will make it worse. One theory, passed down through centuries of court gossip and slightly hysterical historians, is that Catherine's illness was caused or worsened by her refusal to pass gas in public. In an age where courtly etiquette was enforced with almost religious zeal, royal women were expected to maintain an image of perfection. Bodily functions? Not for queens. Even in illness, Catherine likely suppressed every urge that might be seen as improper. This led to a condition described by some sources as an intestinal rupture, or compaction, essentially a dangerous buildup of gas and waste that could cause severe infection. In other words, Catherine may have literally died of politeness. Her final days were spent in excruciating pain, confined to bed, attended by doctors who prescribed enemas, bloodletting, and herbal compresses, none of which worked. Catherine died in 1437 at just 35 years old, and while the official cause of death was likely a combination of infection and neglect, the legend of the queen who died from holding in her farts has endured. Why? Because it captures something essential about royal life, the absurd gap between power and humanity. Catherine had royal blood, royal duties, and a royal marriage. But in the end, her downfall wasn't war, scandal, or treason, it was biology. And maybe, just maybe, a refusal to let loose when it really mattered. Hey guys, tonight we continue the tragic and truly bizarre story of Catherine of Valois, the queen whose royal life was dictated by politics, passion, and possibly by one of the worst abdominal pains in the history of monarchy. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. By the time Catherine of Valois hit her 20s, her life had already become a masterclass in medieval inconvenience. Born into a collapsing French monarchy, sold into an English marriage, widowed before she could enjoy her royal honeymoon, and now stuck in a kingdom that saw her as both a foreigner and a liability. And we haven't even gotten to the worms yet, or the farts. Catherine's position after the death of Henry V was, in one word, awkward, in two words, politically dangerous. Here's why. Her infant son Henry VI was technically King of England, and by treaty also King of France. But let's be honest, an infant king is about as useful in politics as a spoon made of bread. The real power was in the hands of regents, nobles, and whichever group could control the toddler throne dynamic best. Catherine, being the queen dowager, that's a widow queen in medieval speak, should have held some influence. But English lords didn't trust her. Why? Because she was French, young, attractive, and according to Parliament, prone to falling in love with unsuitable men, especially those without royal blood. And for them, nothing spelled catastrophe like a French woman with romantic agency. To preempt any scandal, Parliament passed a law in 1427 effectively banning Catherine from remarrying unless she got the king's permission. The catch? Her son was still a child, meaning that permission would take years, if it ever came at all. In other words, you're young, rich, and single, but don't even think about it. Naturally, Catherine responded the way any forbidden royal might, by secretly hooking up with a charming servant. Enter Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier with unknown origins and even murkier ambitions. Was he a minor noble? A dashing rogue? A man with really nice legs? History isn't sure, but what is clear is that Catherine noticed him, and before long, noticed she was pregnant. Now here's where the story gets delightfully chaotic. Because Catherine and Owen's relationship was unofficial, unapproved, and possibly illegal, their children were considered extremely problematic. Think future political bombshells wrapped in royal swaddling clothes. The couple had at least 6 children, among them Edmund Tudor, who would go on to father Henry VII and kick off the entire Tudor dynasty. But back in the 1430s, this was less destiny and more Catherine, hiding pregnancies and giving birth in secrecy, lived under constant stress. Add to that the pressures of court etiquette, religious scrutiny, and a diet designed to create constipation, and it's no wonder her health began to unravel. Here's where things get uncomfortable. Catherine's abdominal issues weren't just whispered gossip. They were documented. Chronic pain, bloating, and a mysterious internal blockage plagued her final years. Treatments were, predictably, horrific. Her doctors tried the usual medieval remedies, herbal poultices, steaming enemas, because nothing says healing like hot water in the wrong direction. And of course, bloodletting, because when in doubt, drain the life force. But the rumors went deeper. Some claimed Catherine's condition wasn't natural, but a punishment for lust, for disobedience, for breaking the natural order of royal women staying pure, quiet, and obedient. Others said it was the result of her suppressing gas for years in court, afraid to offend the noses of nobles. Let's pause here to appreciate the absurdity. A queen, burdened with the fate of nations, may have died because she was too polite to fart. Could it be true? Medically speaking, holding in gas won't kill you, unless you do it long enough to cause intestinal rupture, which, paired with medieval diets and untreated infections, could absolutely be lethal. And that's what some sources suggest happened: a burst intestine, sepsis, and a death so slow and painful that it scarred her attendants for life. Imagine it: a royal bedchamber heavy with incense as courtiers pretended not to hear her groans, doctors with leeches and syringes of wine applying cures that only made things worse, and Catherine, pale, bloated, and unable to find relief, not from pain, not from politics, and definitely not from pressure, intestinal or otherwise. By 1437, Catherine's body gave out. She died in her early 30s, likely from a mix of infection, exhaustion, and perhaps a lifetime of digestive torture. But death wasn't the end of her royal drama. It was just the intermission. Because the moment Catherine died, the court pounced. Owen Tudor was arrested, charged with daring to love a queen, and thrown into prison. Their children were hidden, their marriage questioned, and Catherine's memory sanitized for public consumption. Officially, she was remembered as the noble widow of Henry V. Unofficially, she was the scandalous mother of a dynasty, and the woman whose death became medieval folklore. Her body was buried at Westminster Abbey, but even in death, Catherine couldn't catch a break. During renovations in the 18th century, her coffin was opened, and her corpse, remarkably well preserved, became a tourist attraction. People literally lined up to gawk at the remains of the queen who couldn't pass gas. Some even kissed her corpse, because apparently 18th century people were weird and gross. It wasn't until the 19th century that Catherine was reburied properly, her coffin sealed and her story mostly forgotten. But her legacy lived on, not just in her descendants, but in the absurd cautionary tale her life became. Stay tuned, because in part 3 we'll explore how Catherine's descendants changed the fate of England, how Owen Tudor escaped death, briefly, and why Catherine's death became a weird whispered legend about etiquette, intestines, and the price of being royal. Let me know when you're ready for more. With Catherine of Valois now lying cold in her grave, you might think the chaos had ended, but you'd be wrong. Because death in royal courts doesn't close chapters, it blows them wide open. And Catherine's death was the match that lit a political fuse no one could put out. First, there was Owen Tudor, her not-so-secret husband, lover, political headache, and now widower. The English court moved fast. Within days of Catherine's passing, Owen was seized and thrown into prison. His crime? Loving a queen without permission, which, to be fair, was technically illegal, but also incredibly hypocritical considering half the court was sleeping with someone they shouldn't have been. The Tudor children, Edmund, Jasper, and their siblings, were suddenly orphans with a huge question mark hanging over their heads. Were they legitimate? Would they be accepted at court? Or would they vanish into the background like so many other inconvenient royal bastards? For a while, things looked bleak. Parliament debated what to do with them. Owen languished in captivity, and the Tudor name was about as desirable as a plague rat at a banquet. And yet, here's where fate pulled one of its cruel but fascinating tricks. The very thing that had made Catherine dangerous in life, her ability to produce heirs, was now what made her children valuable. With Henry VI growing into a painfully indecisive monarch, England's power players realized they might need a backup plan, and the Tudors, with their royal bloodline and charismatic presence, fit the bill. Owen Tudor, remarkably, escaped execution, at least for now. Released from prison under murky circumstances, he returned to court life in a diminished but not destroyed capacity. He was like a shadow of the past, haunting the fringes of power, never quite trusted, never quite gone. His sons, however, began to rise. Edmund Tudor, in particular, gained favor and eventually married Margaret Beaufort, a match that, unknown to them at the time, would set the stage for one of the most seismic shifts in English history, the rise of the Tudor dynasty. But let's not skip ahead too fast, because while the Tudors clawed their way upward, Catherine's legacy morphed into legend, and legend, especially the morbid kind, loves to exaggerate. Rumors about Catherine's death intensified. People whispered about her abdominal pain, the mysterious swelling, and yes, the infamous tale that she died from holding in her gas. Some claimed it was a punishment for pride, others for lust, but most agreed on one thing: Her death was grotesque. Medieval chroniclers, never ones to let facts get in the way of drama, described Catherine's body as bloated, her belly distended, and her suffering immense. Her intestines were said to have ruptured, spilling infection into her body cavity. The royal doctors, helpless as always, tried bleeding, purging, and prayers. None worked. Her agony lasted for days, perhaps weeks. One source even suggested that Catherine, delirious with pain, confessed her love for Owen Tudor on her deathbed, a final scandal to ensure she couldn't rest in peace. Whether true or not, it gave gossip mongers fuel for decades. As time passed, the story warped further. Catherine became a cautionary tale. In courtly circles, her fate was used to warn women about the dangers of desire, the risks of disobedience, and bizarrely, the perils of poor digestion. Even more bizarrely, during the 17th and 18th centuries, Catherine's tomb became a tourist attraction. Visitors at Westminster Abbey were allowed, yes, allowed, to view her body. The coffin had been disturbed during renovations, and her remarkably preserved remains became an exhibit. People gawked, poked, and in one infamous case kissed her corpse. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, recorded such a moment in 1669, proudly boasting that he had kissed the Queen as part of a bet. The Queen, of course, being Catherine's desiccated, worm-eaten body. Royal dignity not in sight. This macabre display continued for over a century until, finally, someone with a shred of decency reinterred Catherine properly. Her coffin was resealed, and her corpse, hopefully, left to rest in peace, but the damage to her reputation had been done. In the public imagination, Catherine was no longer just a tragic queen. She was the woman who died from gas, the lover of a servant, the mother of a dynasty, and the royal mummy kissed by tourists. And through it all, her real story, one of survival, love, political maneuvering, and ultimately loss, was buried beneath layers of gossip, rumor, and centuries of historical fan fiction. Stay with me, because in the final part we'll unravel how Catherine's descendants reshaped England, why her forbidden romance changed royal succession forever, and how her intestines, oddly enough, may have written the prologue to the entire Tudor era. So let's talk about Catherine's legacy, not the ghost story whispered in the halls of Westminster, but the real gritty impact of a queen who died too young and left behind a dynasty. Because while Catherine of Valois exited the stage in a grim haze of pain and scandal, the show she started was far from over. In fact, her forbidden love with Owen Tudor would trigger a chain of events that reshaped the entire English monarchy. Let's start with their son, Edmund Tudor. Remember him? Born under a cloud of uncertainty, with legitimacy constantly questioned and the court divided over his very existence? Well, Edmund grew up smart, ambitious, and with just enough royal blood to make him dangerous. He married Margaret Beaufort, a powerhouse in her own right, and together they had a son, Henry Tudor. You might recognize that name because this boy, born of scandal, ambition, and a royal love affair that technically wasn't supposed to happen, would become King Henry VII. Yes, the Henry who ended the Wars of the Roses, founded the Tudor dynasty, and kicked off a line of rulers that includes Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and all the drama that came with them. None of that happens without Catherine of Valois. Her death may have been humiliating, but her bloodline? Game-changing. Every execution, divorce, and reformation of the next century can be traced back to the queen who broke the rules for love. Let's not forget the irony here. Catherine, who lived under the shadow of royal control, who was told when to marry, when to birth heirs, and when to keep her desires in check, ultimately influenced England more through her forbidden romance than through any sanctioned royal duty. And as for Owen Tudor, his end was less glorious. Despite surviving the initial aftermath of Catherine's death, Owen was eventually captured during a rebellion and executed in 1461. His head was displayed on the gates of Hereford, a grim fate for a man who dared love a queen, but his blood lived on. Through his children and grandchildren, Owen Tudor's name would be carved into the history books, not as a servant, but as the patriarch of a dynasty. So what can we take from Catherine's story? Well, first, that history has a cruel sense of humor. A queen mocked for gas and scandal ends up being the great-grandmother of some of England's most iconic monarchs. Second, that power often comes from the most unexpected places, like a love affair behind closed doors. And finally, that royal history is never clean. It's messy, grotesque, filled with bodily fluids, political betrayals, and the occasional posthumous kiss from a 17th century diarist. Catherine of Valois may have died in discomfort, shrouded in rumor, and reduced to a macabre exhibit for gawking tourists, but she also died a queen who defied the rules, who reshaped the monarchy, and whose descendants wore the crown of England. Her story is a testament to the chaotic power of love, the fragility of royal life, and the way a single decision to follow her heart echoed through centuries. So the next time you hear a joke about a queen who died from holding in a fart, remember the truth beneath the myth. Catherine of Valois wasn't just a cautionary tale. She was the mother of kings, a disruptor of dynasties, and proof that sometimes history starts not with a throne, but with a scandal. Let's rewind one more time, not to Catherine's painful final days or her scandalous romance, but to the deeper truth that always lingers behind the pageantry of royalty, the human cost of living in a gilded cage. Because what happened to Catherine wasn't unique. She just happened to be a queen who lived and died in the spotlight. Her story is one thread in a centuries-long tapestry of royal women who were silenced, sidelined, and sacrificed for political convenience. Catherine of Valois was born into chaos, the daughter of an unstable French king and a court rife with betrayal. From the start, her body wasn't her own. It was a political pawn. She was married off to Henry V, not because anyone thought they'd be soulmates, but because their union looked good on paper. A treaty wrapped in silk and roses. And yet, amid all the control and protocol, Catherine tried to live. She tried to love. First with a king she barely knew, then with a man who was never supposed to touch her. In both cases, she paid the price. We can talk all day about ulcers, gas, and questionable medical decisions, but what truly killed Catherine of Valois was a lifetime of repression. Her body broke down because it was never allowed to be her own. It's easy to laugh at the idea of a queen dying from holding in her farts. It's the kind of grotesque trivia that history loves to regurgitate. But beneath that absurdity is a brutal truth. Catherine was trapped. By duty, by expectations, by the constant pressure to appear perfect, obedient, and silent. And in the end, her silence killed her. Not metaphorically, literally. Because whether or not she truly held in gas to maintain royal decorum, the fact remains that her pain was ignored, her autonomy erased, and her life shortened by a system that treated queens as breeding stock and political currency. But here's where the story takes a twist. Catherine may have died tragically, but her legacy exploded like fireworks over English history. Her blood flowed into the veins of kings and queens who redefined monarchy itself. Her grandson, Henry VII, survived civil war and united England under one crown. Her great-grandson, Henry VIII, broke from the Catholic Church and reshaped religion in the name of royal authority. Her great-great-granddaughter, Elizabeth I, became one of the most iconic rulers in world history, all from a queen whose love was forbidden, whose life was stifled, whose death was a cautionary tale. And yet, she endured, not just in portraits or royal lineage, but in the lessons she left behind, that the human spirit, even when smothered by duty, can ripple through time and change the course of history. So next time you hear someone make a joke about Catherine of Valois and her tragic end, you'll know the truth. She wasn't just the queen who died of decorum. She was the queen who broke the mold, loved against the rules, and whose legacy, like it or not, shaped a nation. And maybe, just maybe, her ghost really does walk Westminster, not because she's trapped, but because history still hasn't fully reckoned with the price she paid. That, my friends, is the real story of Catherine of Valois. Queen, lover, mother, legend, not a punchline, a turning point. Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story so bizarre, so grim, and so darkly absurd that it could only belong to the pages of history's strangest chapters. Picture this, a king, a throne, and a death so undignified it's been whispered about for centuries. We're talking about George II, the monarch whose final moments were spent not in glorious battle or a grand royal bed, but on the most humiliating seat in the house, the toilet. This is no Hollywood epic. This is the raw, unfiltered truth of a king's last stand, where the throne room became a tomb. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Welcome to October 25th, 1760. You're in Herrenhausen Palace, Hanover, a sprawling, opulent maze of marble and gold, where the air smells of wax candles, old books, and the faint musk of royal excess. The sun's barely up, and the palace is stirring, servants scurrying like ants in a kicked-over hill. You're not a king, not a noble, not even a particularly well-fed courtier. You're just you, dropped into this moment, rubbing sleep from your eyes, your breath fogging in the chilly morning air. And somewhere in this gilded labyrinth, King George II, ruler of Great Britain and elector of Hanover, is about to meet his end in a way no one could have predicted. Spoiler alert, it's not heroic, it's not even dignified. It's the kind of exit that makes you wince, laugh, and maybe double-check the sturdiness of your own bathroom fixtures. Let's set the scene. It's 6 a.m., and the palace is a hive of quiet chaos. Maids are stoking fires in hearths that never seem to warm the drafty halls. Footmen are polishing silver that's worth more than their entire village. And you're probably wondering how you ended up here. In a world where the closest thing to central heating is a pile of logs and a prayer. The king's day is about to begin, but let's not romanticize it. George II isn't waking up to a golden sunrise and a choir of angels. He's 76 years old, which in the 18th century is like being a walking museum exhibit. His body's a roadmap of ailments, creaking joints, a heart that's been working overtime, and a digestive system that's seen better days. He's not the strapping young prince who once charmed the courts of Europe. He's a grumpy, stubborn old man who's been king for 33 years and is frankly a bit over it. You follow the clatter of boots and the rustle of silk down a corridor, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors glaring from the walls. The palace is a paradox. It's grand, sure, but it's also a creaky, cold, slightly damp relic of a bygone era. The floor is grown underfoot, and the air carries a whiff of mildew beneath the perfume of wealth. You're headed toward the king's private apartments, where the morning routine is already underway. George II's valet, a wiry man named Friedrich, is laying out the king's clothes, itchy wool stockings, a linen shirt that's been starched to the point of cruelty, and a wig that looks like it's plotting world domination. The king himself is nowhere to be seen yet. He's behind a heavy oak door, in a small, unassuming room that no one talks about, but everyone knows exists, the privy. Now, let's pause for a second. The 18th century isn't exactly the golden age of plumbing. If you're picturing a gleaming porcelain throne with a soft, close lid, erase that image immediately. The king's toilet is more like a wooden box with a hole cut into it, perched over a stone chute that leads somewhere, probably to a pit below the palace, though no one's eager to investigate. The seat is polished, sure, because this is a king we're talking about, but it's still a far cry from comfort. There's no flush valve, no roll of triple ply. If you're lucky, there's a scrap of linen or a handful of straw nearby, but that's about it. Privacy? Barely. The door might be closed, but the walls are thin and the servants are always hovering. This is where George II, sovereign of an empire, starts his day. And, as it turns out, this is where it's going to end. You're standing outside, maybe shivering in the drafty hall when you hear it. A groan. Not the kind of groan you make when you realize you forgot your lines for a big meeting. This is deeper, guttural, the sound of a man wrestling with something internal and unforgiving. Inside that privy, George II is struggling. His face, normally ruddy from a lifetime of rich food and richer wine, is pale. His hands grip the arms of the wooden seat, knuckles white. He's not just dealing with the usual morning business. Something's wrong, very wrong. His chest feels like it's being crushed by an invisible anvil. His breath comes in short, ragged gasps. He tries to call out, but his voice is a rasp, swallowed by the thick walls. This isn't how a king is supposed to go. Not here, not like this. Let's rewind a bit to understand how we got here. George II wasn't born to be a legend. He was a practical man, a soldier at heart, who'd spent his life navigating the messy politics of Europe. Born in 1683 in Hanover, he was a German prince before he was a British king, part of the House of Hanover that took over the British throne in 1714 after Queen Anne died without an heir. His father, George I, wasn't exactly Mr. Popular, and George II didn't fare much better. He spoke English with a thick German accent, which didn't win him many fans in London. He was short-tempered, obsessed with military discipline, and had a notorious feud with his own son Frederick, who he basically thought was a useless dandy. But George II wasn't a pushover. He led troops in battle, survived assassination plots, and kept Britain's empire chugging along during a time of war and rebellion. He was, in his own way, a survivor, until now. Back in the Privy, the situation is deteriorating fast. George's heart, which has been ticking like a worn-out clock for years, is giving up. Modern doctors would call it an aortic aneurysm, a tear in the main artery carrying blood from the heart. In 1760, they don't have a name for it. They just know that when a man clutches his chest and collapses, it's usually a one-way ticket to the afterlife. George slumps forward, his wig slipping askew, his body crumpling like a marionette with cut strings. The wooden seat creaks under his weight, the only sound in the room now besides the faint drip of something unpleasant down that stone chute. Outside, Friedrich the valet is starting to worry. The king's been in there too long. He knocks, hesitantly at first, then harder. "Your Majesty?" No answer. You're still in the hallway and the mood is shifting. The servants are whispering now, their faces tight with that universal look of something's not right. Friedrich pushes open the door, and there he is, George II, King of Great Britain, Elector of Hanover, sprawled on his privy, his eyes glassy, his breath gone. The scene is grotesque, absurd, and oddly human. This isn't the death of a myth, it's the death of a man caught in the most vulnerable moment imaginable. The valet lets out a shout and the palace erupts. Footmen run, maids scream, and somewhere in the distance a bell starts tolling. Not for morning prayers, but for something far grimmer. Word spreads like wildfire. The king is dead, and not just dead, dead on the toilet. The courtiers, who spend their lives perfecting the art of looking unbothered, are struggling to keep straight faces. The servants, who know better than to gossip openly, are already trading stories in hushed tones. By noon, the news is racing across Hanover, and soon it'll hit London, Paris, and beyond. George II, the man who faced down armies, is now the punchline of a cosmic joke. His legacy, built on decades of rule, is about to be overshadowed by the most humiliating detail of all. The king who died on the throne, the wrong kind of throne. But let's not rush past this moment. Let's linger in the chaos of that morning, because this is where the story gets juicy. The palace is a circus now. Nobles are tripping over their own egos, trying to figure out who's in charge. The king's body is still warm, but already the vultures are circling. Politicians, advisors, distant cousins with dreams of power. Someone has to tell the queen, Caroline, who's been dead for years, so that job falls to the king's mistress, Amelie, who's probably wondering if this is her cue to pack up and flee. The privy itself becomes a sort of grim pilgrimage site, with servants sneaking glances at the scene of the crime, half expecting the king to sit up and yell at them for slacking off. You're still here, watching it all unfold, and you can't help but feel the weight of it. This isn't just a king's death, it's a reminder that no one, not even a monarch, gets to choose how they exit. George II spent his life building an image of strength, but history doesn't care about your image when you're found slumped over a wooden box. The 18th century is a brutal time, full of disease, war, and a shocking lack of indoor plumbing. Death is everywhere, smallpox, typhus, a bad batch of stew. But to die like this, it's almost too perfect, too poetic in its absurdity. The king who ruled an empire couldn't rule his own body in the end. As the day wears on, the palace settles into an uneasy rhythm. The body is moved carefully to a more dignified location, though the servants will never unsee what they saw. Plans are made for a state funeral, but the whispers are already louder than the official proclamations. George II's death is a scandal, a tragedy, and a comedy all at once, and you, standing in the shadows of this chaotic mourning, can't help but wonder, what does it all mean? Was this just a freak accident, or is there something bigger at play, a lesson about pride, mortality, or the sheer randomness of life? We're not done yet. This is just the beginning of George II's final chapter, and there's so much more to unpack. Who was this man, really, beyond the punchline? What was life like in his world, where even kings couldn't escape the indignities of the human condition? And how does a single mortifying moment reshape a legacy? Stick with me, because in the next part, we're diving deeper into George II's life, his court, and the wild, messy, often disgusting world of 18th century Europe. You won't want to miss it. You're back in Herrenhausen Palace, October 25th, 1760, and the air is thick with shock, whispers, and the faint smell of something you'd rather not identify. George II, King of Great Britain and Elector of Hanover, has just met his maker on a wooden privy, his body now lying in state somewhere less mortifying, while the court scrambles to make sense of it all. You're still here, a fly on the wall, watching the chaos unfold like a tragic comedy. Servants are darting through the halls, their faces a mix of fear and barely suppressed gossip. Nobles are already plotting, their powdered wigs bobbing as they whisper about succession and power. And somewhere, a poor maid is probably tasked with cleaning that privy, wondering how her life came to this. But to understand how George II ended up as history's most unfortunate punchline, we need to step back, way back, and explore the man, his world, and the gritty reality of the 18th century that shaped his final moments. Let's start with George himself. Born in 1683 in Hanover, a German state that was more farmland than empire, George Augustus wasn't destined for greatness, at least not at first. His family, the House of Hanover, was a respectable but not exactly dazzling bunch, more known for their stubbornness than their charisma. When Queen Anne of Britain died in 1714 without an heir, the British throne needed a Protestant ruler to keep the Catholic Stuarts at bay. Enter the Hanoverians, who were about 50th in line but had the right religion. George's father, George I, became king, and young George II, then a 30-year-old prince with a chip on his shoulder, was dragged to London, a city that didn't exactly roll out the red carpet for its new German overlords. Picture George II in his prime, stocky, red face with a temper that could make a thunderstorm look calm. He wasn't a poet or a philosopher. He was a soldier, a pragmatist, a man who loved order, military parades, and shouting at anyone who dared disagree with him. His English was clunky, laced with a German accent that made London's snobby courtiers snicker behind their fans. He didn't care much for Britain's muddy streets or its rowdy politics, but he was determined to rule it, and rule he did for 33 years, through wars, rebellions, and a family drama that could rival any modern soap opera. His wife, Caroline of Ansbach, was the brains of the operation, a sharp-witted woman who navigated court politics while George stomped around yelling about discipline. Their marriage was solid, but their relationship with their son, Frederick, was a disaster. Think shouting matches, public humiliations, and one time when George literally kicked Frederick out of the palace. Now, fast forward to 1760. George II is 76, an old man in a young man's game. His health is a wreck, his eyesight's fading, his legs are swollen, and his heart's been acting up for years. Doctors in the 18th century aren't exactly equipped to handle this. Their toolkit includes leeches, mercury pills, and a lot of guesswork. If you're sick, you're as likely to die from the cure as the disease. George's diet doesn't help. Rich meats, heavy wines, and puddings that could double as doorstops. The man's arteries are probably more clogged than a London gutter after a rainstorm. And yet, he's still king, still dragging himself to council meetings, still barking orders at servants who've learned to nod and scurry before he throws something. Let's talk about the world George lived in, because it's not the powdered wig fantasy you see in movies. The 18th century is a grimy, brutal place, even for a king. Herrenhausen Palace might look grand from the outside, with its manicured gardens and golden chandeliers, but inside, it's a drafty, creaky maze of stone and wood. The walls are damp, the fireplaces belch smoke, and the air is a cocktail of candle wax, body odor, and whatever's rotting in the kitchen. Hygiene? Barely a concept. People bathe maybe once a month if they're feeling fancy. Toothbrushes exist, but they're for the elite, and even then, they're just sticks with bristles that shred your gums. George's teeth, like most people's, are probably a horror show. Yellowed, crooked, and a few missing, thanks to a lifetime of sugar and no dental floss. And then there's the privy situation. We touched on it last time, but let's dive deeper, because it's key to our story. In 1760, indoor plumbing is a pipe dream, pun intended. Even in a palace, the toilet is a glorified bucket or a wooden seat over a chute. For the wealthy, these privies are tucked into small rooms called garderobes, often built into the palace walls. The waste drops into a pit, or, if you're really lucky, a moat. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. These chutes are breeding grounds for flies, rats, and smells that could knock out a horse. Cleaning them is a job for the lowest servants who probably draw straws to avoid it. And privacy? Forget it. Kings might get a door, but the walls are thin and servants are always nearby, ready to hand over a rag, or, if you're George, a stern lecture about eating fewer pies. This is the reality George II faced every morning, including his last. Picture him, a 76-year-old king waddling to his privy in a nightshirt, his joints creaking like old floorboards. It's not glamorous, but it's human. Kings, peasants, courtiers, everyone's at the mercy of their bowels in the 18th century. The difference is, when a king dies on the privy, it's not just a personal tragedy, it's a public spectacle. Back in that fateful moment, as George slumped forward, his heart giving out, the palace was already spinning into chaos. His valet, Friedrich, found him first, and you can imagine the poor man's panic, knocking, shouting, then bursting in to see his king, wig askew, sprawled like a discarded puppet. The image is grim, but there's a dark humor to it, the kind that makes you laugh and cringe at the same time. The news hits the court like a cannonball. Servants are running, nobles are arguing, and someone's already drafting a letter to London to inform the government. George's grandson, young George III, is next in line, but he's in England, blissfully unaware that he's about to inherit a throne and a scandal. The courtiers in Hanover are trying to keep things dignified, but good luck with that. The story's too juicy. By evening, whispers of "the king died where" are spreading through the palace like wildfire. The servants, who see everything and say nothing, are probably swapping bets on how long it'll take for the story to reach the taverns. Spoiler, not long. Let's zoom out for a second and talk about why this matters. George II's death isn't just a quirky footnote, it's a snapshot of a time when life was fragile, even for the powerful. The 18th century doesn't care if you're a king or a cobbler. Death comes for everyone, often in the most undignified ways. Smallpox could wipe out a village, a cut could turn septic, and a bad heart could drop you mid-sentence, or, in George's case, mid-sit. Medicine is more witchcraft than science, with doctors bleeding patients to balance the humors, or prescribing concoctions that sound like they belong in a witch's cauldron. Hospitals? More like death traps. If you're sick, you're better off praying than visiting a physician. But there's something else at play here, the clash between royal image and human reality. George II spent his life projecting strength, leading armies, crushing rebellions, holding court like a proper monarch. Yet in death, he's reduced to a punchline, a reminder that no amount of gold or power can shield you from the absurdity of being human. The privy, that humble wooden box, levels the playing field. It's where kings and peasants meet on equal terms, where the crown means nothing and biology rules supreme. And in 1760, that irony isn't lost on anyone. The courtiers might try to spin it, but the truth is out, and it's not going away. As the day of George's death stretches into night, the palace is a whirlwind of activity. The body's been moved to a grand bedchamber, draped in velvet to restore some semblance of dignity. Messengers are dispatched to London, carrying news that'll shake the empire. The privy, that infamous scene, is quietly scrubbed clean, but the story lingers like a bad smell. And you, standing in the flickering candlelight, can't help but feel the weight of it all. This is a moment that'll echo through history, not for its grandeur, but for its raw, uncomfortable truth. We're not done yet. George II's story is more than a single day's disaster. In the next part, we'll dig into the aftermath, how the news spread, how the court and country reacted, and how a king's legacy was forever tangled with the toilet. We'll explore the gritty details of 18th century life that made this moment possible, from the food that clogged George's arteries to the politics that shaped his reign. So stick around, because this tale only gets wilder from here. It's still October 25th, 1760, and Herrenhausen Palace is a pressure cooker of panic, ambition, and barely contained laughter. King George II, ruler of Great Britain and Elector of Hanover, is dead, found slumped on his privy in a scene so undignified it's already rewriting his legacy. You're still here, a silent observer in the flickering candlelight, watching the court unravel like a badly stitched tapestry. The king's body has been whisked away to a grand bedchamber, draped in velvet to hide the truth of his final moments, but the damage is done. The whispers are spreading faster than a plague, and by morning, the story of the king who died on the toilet will be the talk of Europe. Let's dive into the aftermath, the world that shaped this moment, and the gritty, grotesque details of 18th century life that made it possible. The palace is a hive of activity, but it's not mourning that's driving the chaos, it's politics. George II's death leaves a vacuum, and in the 18th century, vacuums are filled by schemers faster than you can say crown. His grandson, George III, is next in line, a 22-year-old who's currently in England, probably sipping tea and blissfully unaware that he's about to inherit an empire and a scandal. Messengers are already saddling horses to carry the news across the channel. But in Hanover, the court is a circus. Nobles are jostling for influence, advisors are drafting proclamations, and someone's probably already measuring the throne room for new curtains. The king's mistress, Amelie von Walmoden, is keeping a low profile, knowing her days of power are numbered. Meanwhile, the servants, those unsung heroes of every royal drama, are cleaning up the mess, literally and figuratively, while trading stories in hushed tones. Let's talk about how this news spreads, because in 1760, there's no X, no instant updates, no viral posts. Information travels at the speed of a horse or a ship, which means the story of George's death is going to simmer and mutate as it moves. In Hanover, the servants are the first to know, and they're not shy about sharing. By midday, the local taverns are buzzing with the tale, each retelling more exaggerated than the last. Heard the king drop dead on the pot, one drunkard slurs, while another swears George was poisoned by a vengeful cook. By the time the news reaches London a few days later, it's a full-blown scandal, with pamphlets and ballads already in the works. The British public, never particularly fond of their German-born king, laps it up. Caricatures start circulating, crude drawings of a wigged monarch clutching a privy seat, his crown tumbling into the abyss. But why does this story hit so hard? To understand that, we need to zoom out and look at the 18th century world George inhabited. This is a time when life is short, brutal, and often disgusting, even for royalty. Let's start with the basics. Health. Medicine in 1760 is a gamble at best, a death sentence at worst. Doctors rely on theories like the four humors, which sound scientific but are about as useful as a horoscope. Got a fever? They'll bleed you with leeches until you're too weak to complain. Heart problems? Try a tonic of mercury and herbs that'll either cure you or make you glow in the dark. George II's aortic aneurysm, the likely cause of his death, was a mystery to his physicians. They might have called it a fit or apoplexy, but they had no tools to diagnose or treat it. Autopsies were rare, and even if they happened, they were more about curiosity than science. The king's body was probably examined, but the report, if it existed, focused more on his dignity than the gruesome details. Then there's the food. Oh, the food. If you're picturing elegant banquets with sparkling wine and delicate pastries, think again. The 18th century diet, even for a king, is a heart attack waiting to happen. George's meals were heavy on meat. Roasted beef, pork, venison, often swimming in fatty sauces. Vegetables? Barely an afterthought, unless you count turnips boiled into submission. Bread was coarse, often moldy, and desserts were sugar-laden gut bombs. Wine and ale flowed freely, which didn't help George's already strained heart. The palace kitchens were a nightmare of hygiene, with flies buzzing over unrefrigerated meat and cooks who thought washing hands was a suggestion. Food poisoning was so common it was practically a personality trait. Add to that the lack of exercise. George wasn't exactly jogging through the palace gardens, and you've got a recipe for disaster. Let's not forget the privy itself, because it's the star of this grim show. We've talked about the lack of plumbing, but it's worth doubling down. Herrenhausen's garderobes were a step above the peasant's bucket, but not by much. The wooden seat was polished, sure, but the chute below led to a pit that was rarely cleaned. The smell was a constant, a mix of human waste and damp stone that no amount of lavender could mask, and the act of using it, not exactly a moment of zen. You're balancing on a narrow seat, hoping the wood doesn't splinter while the cold air creeps up from below. For George, at 76, this was no easy task. His body was failing, his mobility was shot, and every trip to the privy was a small ordeal. That morning, as he sat down, his heart was already a ticking bomb, and the strain of the moment, physical and otherwise, pushed it over the edge. Back to the palace, where the day is spiraling. The king's body is now laid out in state, but the real action is in the corridors. The courtiers are in damage control mode, trying to craft a narrative that doesn't involve the word toilet. Good luck with that. The official proclamation will talk about George's long reign, his victories in war, his devotion to duty, but the servants, the ones who saw the body, aren't buying it. They're the ones who'll carry the real story to the streets, where it'll grow legs and run. By the time George III is crowned, the tale of his grandfather's death is already a legend, whispered in alehouses and scribbled in letters. It's a reminder that no amount of royal pomp can outshine the raw humanity of a bad day. Let's talk about George's legacy, because this is where things get messy. He wasn't a bad king, all things considered. He kept Britain stable during the War of the Austrian Succession and the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, where he personally led troops against Bonnie Prince Charlie's rebels. He wasn't a visionary like Elizabeth I or a tyrant like Henry VIII, but he was steady, stubborn, and fiercely proud of his Hanoverian roots. His court was a mix of German efficiency and British chaos, with advisors who spent as much time bickering as governing. His wife, Caroline, was the real power behind the throne, but after her death in 1737, George leaned on his own instincts, which weren't always great. His feud with his son Frederick, who died in 1751, left a bitter mark, and his relationship with the British public was lukewarm at best. They respected him, but they didn't love him. Now, with his death, that legacy is at risk. The Privy Incident overshadows everything, the battles, the treaties, the decades of rule. It's not fair, but history loves a good story, and this one's too good to ignore. In London, the newspapers are already printing snarky poems about the throne that claimed a king. In Paris, the French court, always eager to dunk on their British rivals, is having a field day. And in Hanover, the locals are torn between grief and embarrassment. George was their elector, their hometown boy, but now he's a cautionary tale about the dangers of overindulging in roast beef. You're still here, watching the palace hum with nervous energy. The candles are burning low, and the air is heavy with the weight of what's happened. The servants are scrubbing the privy, but they can't scrub away the story. The nobles are planning a funeral that'll be all pomp and no mention of the truth. And somewhere in a quiet corner, Amelie the mistress is packing her bags knowing the new king won't have much use for her. The world is moving on, but the shadow of that wooden seat looms large. This isn't the end of our tale. George II's death is more than a scandal. It's a window into a time when life was raw, unpredictable, and often absurd. In the next part, we'll explore how this story shaped the reign of George III, how the 18th century grappled with its own fragility, and why this moment still resonates today. We'll dig into the politics, the gossip, and the gritty details of a world where even a king couldn't escape the indignity of being human. So stick with me, because the final chapter of this royal misadventure is coming, and it's going to be a wild ride. It's late on October the 25th, 1760, and Herrenhausen Palace is a flickering maze of candlelight and secrets. King George II is gone, his body now laid out in a velvet-draped bedchamber, far from the privy where he met his end. The air is heavy with grief, ambition, and the faint stench of scandal. You're still here, a silent witness in the shadows, watching the court scramble to rewrite history, while the truth slips through the cracks like water through a sieve. The king's death on the toilet isn't just a personal tragedy. It's a spark that's about to ignite a firestorm of gossip, power plays, and a legacy that'll never quite recover. Let's dive into the final chapter of this bizarre tale, exploring how George II's death reshaped his world, how his grandson grappled with the fallout, and why this story still hits us where it hurts. The palace is a machine in overdrive. Servants are polishing silver for a funeral that'll cost more than most villages see in a lifetime. Nobles are whispering in corners, their wigs practically vibrating with schemes. The official story is taking shape. George II, steadfast king, passed peacefully in his apartments, a ruler to the end. But the servants know better. The valet who found him, Friedrich, is still pale, haunted by the image of his king slumped over that wooden seat. The maids who clean the privy are swapping stories in the kitchen, their voices low, but their eyes bright with the thrill of forbidden gossip. By morning, the tale of the king who died on the pot is already seeping into Hanover's streets, carried by bakers, barmaids, and anyone with a tongue and a grudge. Let's talk about how this news travels, because in 1760, information is a slow, messy beast. Messengers are galloping toward London, their saddlebags stuffed with letters that carefully avoid the word toilet. It'll take days for the news to cross the channel, and when it does, it lands like a cannonball. London's coffee houses, those smoky hubs of gossip and rebellion, are buzzing by early November. Pamphleteers, the 18th century equivalent of tabloid writers, are churning out broadsides with titles like The Monarch's Misfortune or A Throne Most Foul. One particularly cheeky poet pens a ditty about George's last seat, which gets sung in alehouses from Covent Garden to Cheapside. The British public, who never quite warmed to their German-born king, eat it up. For them, it's less a tragedy than a cosmic joke. A king brought low by the one place everyone's equal. Across the Channel, the French are having a field day. France and Britain are locked in the 7 Years' War, and anything that makes the British crown look ridiculous is a propaganda win. In Paris, courtiers at Versailles are snickering over their wine, spinning tales of a king who literally died of embarrassment. The story grows wilder with each retelling. Some say George was poisoned, others claim he was cursed by a Jacobite witch. The truth, an aortic aneurysm triggered by years of bad diet and worse luck, is less exciting but no less brutal. Meanwhile, in Hanover, the locals are torn. George was their elector, a hometown hero of sorts. But this is hard to spin. The taverns are full of half-hearted toasts to his memory, drowned out by laughter at the details. Let's zoom in on George III, the 22-year-old grandson who's about to inherit this mess. He's in London when the news arrives, probably practicing his harpsichord or arguing with his tutors about politics. The kid's earnest, a bit awkward, and desperate to prove he's not his grandfather. George II's reign was stable but uninspiring, marked by wars and a stubborn refusal to charm the public. George III wants to be different, a patriot king, loved by his people. But he's stepping into a role tainted by scandal. The privy story follows him like a bad smell, whispered at court and shouted in the streets. Every time he sits on the actual throne, you can bet someone's stifling a giggle. It's not fair, but history doesn't play fair. To understand why this moment sticks, we need to dive deeper into the 18th century world that made it possible. Life back then is a gauntlet of discomfort and danger, even for a king. Let's start with the palace itself. Herrenhausen is grand, sure, but it's also a logistical nightmare. The stone walls trap the cold, the fireplaces choke the air with smoke, and the floors are either freezing or sticky, depending on what spilled last. Servants haul water from wells, chop wood for fires, and empty chamber pots in a never-ending cycle of drudgery. The king's privy, that infamous wooden box, is a microcosm of this world, functional but flawed, a symbol of how even royalty can't escape the basics of biology. Then there's the medical reality. George II's death was sudden, but it wasn't unexpected. At 76, he was ancient by 18th century standards, where the average lifespan hovered around 40. His heart was a ticking bomb, strained by decades of heavy food, stress, and a lifestyle that didn't exactly scream self-care. The 18th century diet is a cholesterol nightmare. Think greasy mutton, suet puddings, and wine that's more alcohol than grape. Vegetables are scarce, and what passes for salad is usually just a sad pile of herbs. Add to that the lack of sanitation, and you've got a recipe for disaster. Water is often contaminated, so people drink ale or wine instead, which doesn't help the liver or the heart. George's physicians, with their leeches and dubious tonics, were more likely to hasten his end than prevent it. The privy itself deserves a final spotlight, because it's more than just a prop in this story. In 1760, sanitation is a fantasy. Even in a palace, waste management is a grim affair. The garderobe's chute might lead to a pit or a moat, but it's rarely cleaned, and the smell is a constant companion. Flies swarm, rats scurry, and the air is thick with a stench that no amount of perfume can mask. For George, every trip to the privy was a small battle, navigating creaky joints, a weak heart, and the indignity of a seat that offered no comfort. That morning, as he sat down, the strain of the moment was too much. His heart, already frayed, tore apart, and the rest is history or infamy. Let's talk legacy, because this is where the story stings. George II wasn't a bad king. He led Britain through wars, kept the Hanoverian dynasty afloat, and held his own against Europe's scheming monarchs. He wasn't loved, but he was respected, a stubborn old soldier who did his duty. Yet history doesn't remember his victories at Dettingen or his role in stabilizing the empire. It remembers the privy. That single absurd moment overshadows everything, a reminder that fate has a cruel sense of humor. For George III, it's a warning. No matter how grand your reign, one bad day can define you. He'll spend his life trying to outrun his grandfather's shadow, building a reputation that's more heroic, more British, less toilet adjacent. But there's something deeper here, something that makes this story resonate even today. George II's death is a brutal reminder of our shared humanity. Kings, peasants, you, me, we're all at the mercy of our bodies, our bad habits, our dumb luck. The 18th century was a world without safety nets, where a cut could kill you, a meal could poison you, and a morning routine could end your reign. Yet even now, in our world of flush valves and hand sanitizer, we're not so different. We build images, careers, reputations, legacies. But one misstep, one moment of vulnerability can unravel it all. George's story is a mirror, reflecting our own fears of being caught off guard, exposed in our most human moments. As the palace settles into an uneasy quiet, the candles burn low and the funeral plans take shape. George II's body will be shipped to London for a state burial, complete with all the pomp a king deserves. The privy will be forgotten, at least officially, but the story will live on, passed down through centuries, from tavern tales to history books to videos like this one. You're standing in the fading light, watching the court move on, but the weight of this moment lingers. It's not just about a king or a toilet. It's about the fragility of power, the absurdity of life, and the stories we tell to make sense of it all. And so we leave George II, not on a throne of gold, but on a seat of wood, a king brought low by the one thing no crown can conquer, mortality. His death wasn't glorious, but it was human, and maybe that's the real lesson here. Thanks for joining me on this wild ride through the 18th century, where even the mightiest couldn't escape the mess of being alive. Until next time, keep those lights dim, those fans humming, and your sense of humor ready for whatever history throws our way.